update? Nope. Okay. We'll get that maybe in between items then. Councillor Kelly, were you able to log in?
Well, we'll see. I'm not feeling a lot of love right now, but you do have printouts of my presentation.
We do have printouts of your
That's
presentation.
my really, really cool animation, which is why you've got...
Why we've got printouts.
No, it's why you've got the picture thing in the middle. But let's see if it... Here we go.
Ah, excellent.
All right. Had me nervous for a moment.
Okay. Well, whenever you're ready then, we'll...
Okay. Thank you all for... Thank you. Super. Thank you all for coming. My name is... Which one should I use?
You can
I'm
speak
asking him, thank you very
the
much.
one at the stand, please, and the other
This one?
will hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. I feel like a performer here. My name is Craig Kelly. I live at 6 St. Gerard Terrace, and I'm here to talk about accessory dwelling units, also called ADUs. You probably remember I have been here before talking about the same thing, and the board had some very useful comments that I did my best to incorporate. I then presented a somewhat different version of the petition to the ordinance committee, who had some different thoughts completely than what you had. And all of this reflects all I was trying to do was to address some relatively minor challenges with our accessory dwelling units, and it became the opportunity to talk about this issue in ways that I had no history of and really have no opinions on. That part hasn't changed. I've done my best to come back to you with something that I think you'll like better, and I'm really hoping that I can go to the ordinance committee with something that they have fewer concerns about. But I never intended for this to be a discussion about pre-existing parts of the ADU that I wasn't trying to change, but it has become something about that. So forgive me if I seem a little unable to answer some of the foundational questions you might have. That wasn't my intent to address them in the beginning, but I will do my best. So the basic, that is slide 1. Okay. The basic regulatory program for ADUs already exists. We passed it long ago. The challenge is that it doesn't work perfectly. We want people to have these accessory dwelling units, but it turns out that some people don't have a big enough lot or minimum size for an additional unit, whatever. They just couldn't get the approval through the inspectional services they needed to get a variance to do this, and a variance can be a very difficult thing to get for a variety of reasons. I don't think the council wanted the ADUs to have to jump through those hurdles to become things. So I wrote, with some help from Patrick Barrett, who's not here, and also Jeff from the planning board, CDD, who's not here, this proposal. I did it sort of after my friend Bob Binstock, who came last time, stopped me and he said, Craig, you passed this ADU ordinance. I thought it'd be a great idea. I'm going to put in a basement apartment. It's going to help me meet my retirement goals. And I'm poking along, and all of a sudden it turns out I don't meet the zoning requirements. So then he had to hire an attorney. He could have bagged the whole thing, and looking backwards, maybe he would. But once he was into it far enough, it was difficult to back out painlessly. So he wound up getting an attorney, and that took time, and then that kicked the contract back, and the whole thing cost thousands and thousands and thousands more dollars than it would have had we just said you can do this without needing a variance, which is what I think the council wanted to do. So what we all seem to want is people to be able to convert existing self-contained parts of their homes to an extra dwelling unit without needing to get a variance. We all seem to want some level of oversight, and flooding's come up, for example, before, but privacy, neighborhood character, those things, we don't want it just to be any old thing. We want it to have some sort of oversight. And we want to create more housing opportunities without a corresponding increase in building size and number. So we don't want people under the ADUs. I'm not saying just as a general policy perspective, but under the ADUs, we're not thinking that people are going to jack up their houses or they're going to expand their ground floor by 50 square feet or whatever. We're thinking that you work within the footprint. This is what we want. This is Bob Binstock's house, so he's here sort of in theory. We want that to happen without the need to hire an attorney to go to the BZA to get a variance. So what we seem not to be sure of is we're not sure about using pre-existing garages for accessory dwelling units. Me, I'm a fan. As I think I told you last time when I was in the Marines, my girlfriend at the time lived in a garage. It was tiny. It was probably a third the size of this room, and it worked great for a single woman who was a bank teller, right? It was absolutely perfect. So me, I'm a fan. I can understand other people might not be. So that's something that as a group, people seem sort of less certain of it than I am. Ownership status of the main building, honestly, that's an artifact of previous zoning. It's not something I care hugely about. I think the planning board and the ordinance committee fall on different sides of that discussion, and I feel sort of like a kid in the middle of a family squabble. I don't really care what my parents decide. I just want them to decide one way or the other and let the whole party disappear. Amount of previous modification, well, I don't know that anyone cares that much about that. I remember here we talked about it last time. Why a certain amount? How do you figure that out? When do you figure it out? Use as a short-term rental, honestly, I personally don't care what they use it as. It's a dwelling unit. It's a thing that if it's used as a short-term rental will free up some other unit to be used as a non-short-term rental, perhaps. I don't think that's part of this discussion, for me at least. And the start date on the proposal, it was already a month and a half ago. So clearly we can't go backwards in time. And it's especially relevant for building alterations if we want to pick a start date other than just whenever this is finally ordained, assuming hopefully it gets ordained. So we seem not to be sure of things like my freestanding garage. So that's my house. That garage in the back, I think, would make a wonderful accessory dwelling unit. We don't seem to want it. And in fairness, my house is too small to fit. It's, I think, 1,600 square feet or something. My house is too small to fall into this category anyways. But that's just an example of something we don't seem to want. But if we did want it, it would work perfectly, I think. So the intent of these proposed amendments is we want people to be able to do it without getting a variance. And you see I highlighted something here. There's new language, and you should have two versions of the ordinance in front of you. One, which is the existing one, and then the other is a proposal. And the proposal has a couple of things it didn't have last time, one of which is about height changes, because there's some concern that if you're putting an egress into your basement unit, maybe you wind up changing the elevation that you measure the building height from, so the building doesn't truly get taller, but somehow it gets measured as being taller, and we don't want that to happen. We don't want the building to get truly taller either, but we don't want to change the measurements to suddenly create another nonconformity. We wanted existing and mostly unmodified freestanding structures like garages to be used for accessory units. And the unmodified part, again, that was a little bit confusing last time. I think in theory, we don't care if it's modified or not, as long as it's not being modified to become the accessory dwelling unit. So if I modified my house 5 years ago, and now I decide that my wife decides whatever, that we can put an accessory dwelling unit in the basement, that's fine. But altering it so that we could put the accessory dwelling unit in the basement, not so much so. And garages seem to be a little bit of a sticking point. We want to get rid of the parking requirements as they would impact an ADU. As an aside, I think we should just get rid of parking requirements in general. But certainly this is something that stands in the way frequently of having a unit. And to get rid of the lot size requirements and to allow for, and There should be a space between and get to allow for and get rid of height concerns for basement egress and entrance. And you'll see in the language too, there's stuff about if you, and this falls under the building code as I understand things. If you have an egress, say you have a downstairs basement, well, your basement's always going to be downstairs, but you have a ADU, and you go out of that, you may create some sort of sheddy thing. I don't even know what it's called, but it's probably got a real word, to allow you to go outside and go upstairs. It doesn't count as, under this, it wouldn't count against your anything for the ADU. You understand that you need some sort of sheddy thing to cover the stairs as you step out of the building. And to get rid of the ownership requirement. That's not in here, by the way. The ownership requirement is out of the proposal that you have. So there are concerns. Would it raise the value of property? And honest to God, I hope so. That is why Bob Binstock is doing it, and that's why anyone would do it, is to raise the value of their property. Generally, that's why we renovate our bathrooms and our kitchens, or at least if it's not the reason we do it, we hope that it's a side effect. So that's not a reason in my mind to say no. It may allow new detached structures like garages to be built and then used as, I've spelled ADUs in so many different ways. I don't even know what an odds is, but should be ADU. We changed that. So the language there clearly says pre-existing garage. So that's not something we would want to allow. Difficult to enforce. You could say that about virtually any ordinance in the city, zoning or otherwise. And these things tend to be complaint driven. And again, that's not a reason to say no. More concerns may be used for non-single or two-family homes. I would say yes, absolutely. If a six-family building could put an ADU in the basement, then fine. I don't see why that would be a problem. And detached ADUs may negatively impact a neighbor's privacy. That tends to be the garage, or maybe someone's got a shed in the back, a big shed in the back argument. Those are things to be concerned about. I think it's less likely with ground floor structures given the sight lines and stuff, but nonetheless, there is some jurisdiction within the BZA to say this is too much of an impact on privacy to go forward. So that's my presentation, and you'll see you have two versions. You have the existing version, which is what you would get if you downloaded it now, and I've done my best to highlight things that are in the existing version that we addressed, and then you'll see a non-existing version, which is the proposed version, that I tried to highlight stuff that's new since last time. So, for example, the bit about the height should be highlighted in that. So I don't care what this language says. I want the next Bob Binstock to be able to build an ADU without needing variances. So if I missed something, if something's misstated, if it can be made better, there's no pride of authorship here. I would just like something that goes before the ordinance committee, and the ordinance committee jumps up and down and says this is great, and then goes before the city council, and they say it's great, and then the next Bob Binstock can do what the council long ago wanted Bob to be able to do without needing a variance. So thank you for your attention. I'd be glad to entertain any questions.
Okay. Does the board want to ask questions either of Councilor Kelly or staff first, or hear any public comment first? This is a public hearing. Okay. We'll take public comment first then. Lou, can you pass me? All right. So, Carol, I hear you're the only person officially signed up. So if you would like to come forward and share your thoughts, that would be great. We'll do our usual 3 minutes with the timer. Give your name and address.
So I can read.
For fear of, yes, you can.
Oh.
Of course.
That's all. You were afraid to. Don't start it yet. I am told, before you start, I am told that I am the slowest speaker in the world. My name is Carol O'Hare, 172 Magazine Street. Excuse my lack of knowledge about the chairmanship flip-flopping or switching. That was not on the website yet. It's on the to-do list. My major concern about this proposal is the very last sentence of the amendment. That is the amendment that I saw online, which is the short version. And I said in my email today, yikes. Have both the Cambridge, the amendment says, any accessory apartment or basement egress or stairwell may extend beyond the minimum yard regulations within the meaning of section 5.24.2 in all districts. Yikes. Have both fire department and ISD personnel considered fire safety aspects of permitting such egress and stairwell structures to encroach into or even entirely block the very narrow side yards that the CZO currently authorizes in many residential areas. And the 5-foot side yard that would be authorized if the 100% affordable housing overlay is adopted. How can hoses and firemen and ambulances, how can they get through on side yards? The other comments that I have relate to consistency of zoning terminology. We have a zoning ordinance that was very clear in its definitional terms. And as amendments are drafted by non-zoning experts, and I don't criticize Councillor Kelly at all for this, but I say as an aside, I think that this department needs an in-house lawyer. I've told that to Iram on a number of occasions, who is totally familiar with the terminology of the zoning ordinance. I have given you in the red line copy that I sent today, that you have in your emails, many highlighted instances where this proposal uses its own terminology, not the already defined terms in the ordinance. Like dwelling is a defined term. Instead, this uses apartment. Building is a defined term. This amendment uses structure. Please insist that the proper terminology be used, because otherwise our zoning ordinance is going to turn into an undecipherable mess. That's the main gist. And there's a spelling error. Principal should be spelled principal someplace in there. It's in my red line version. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
Thank you, Madam Chair. John Hawkinson. It appeared to me from the presentation that the board received updated zoning language for this hearing that was not made publicly available to anyone prior to, and I would ask that staff ensure that that sort of thing doesn't happen, because it kind of makes the public hearing process far less useful than it otherwise would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's worth clarifying. Jeff, is the language that we received in the handouts today, is it just a different presentation of the same language that's on the website, or is it new language? And if you don't know, maybe Councillor Kelly can speak to that.
Thanks. I'm asking my colleague to show me the language that you received. So I believe there is an additional, is it just the additional clause 5 at the end that was the change in this version I'm I'm holding in my hand. I'm sorry, I'm asking because I'm not selling. And while you're looking at that, I'll ask: do we have additional copies of this? Okay, we can circulate them to whomever needs them.
So it looks like it's 5, but I am comparing what I'm talking about now to what is currently on the books as our existing zoning, rather than what I originally submitted. And of course, this is a process, so it will change, and it will probably change again on the council floor. So I would love to have absolute perfect knowledge amongst everyone, but this is something that will change regularly. So as it changes, I think the best we can do is highlight those changes and make sure that when we make them, everyone knows as best as possible where they have been made, which is why they are highlighted in your document.
Right. So,
Jeff, I think the additional paragraph 5 in proposed section 422.2 is the only change from the zoning text presented on February 5th, 2018, that was attached to CDD's memo and was posted on the website.
May I ask a question of Jeff or the CDD staff? In the ordinary course, so I understand our role right now as one of offering a recommendation to the city council or the ordinance committee about whether they should adopt, whether the city council should adopt this ordinance. And so it makes sense to me that the city council might at some point amend the language that goes through this process, but I'm confused by the idea that the language would change after our recommendation without it coming before us. And so what is the ordinary process by which language goes through the planning board and then reaches the city council?
Excellent question. So normally a zoning petition goes to both the planning board and the ordinance committee for hearing and recommendation. From those, the ordinance committee is a committee of the city council. Those go off sort of on parallel tracks, although there's often some kind of communication between, or part of the role of CDD staff is to kind of shuttle a little bit between the ordinance committee and the planning board to have some continuity in the discussions that happen. Both of those committees, or the board and the ordinance committee, would send reports back to the city council, and then the city council ultimately makes a vote on or decides whether to take action and what action to take on the zoning petition. Now, during the course of this process, there can be and often are amendments made to the petition, and some of those amendments many of those amendments come based on the recommendations of the planning board and the ordinance committee. So normally, after the planning board makes its recommendation, that goes to the full council, and then along with the ordinance committee recommendation, it's all considered, and the council can take whatever action it likes. This one is maybe a little bit unusual. It's the first time I can think of where the petition changed in a number of ways between the between the planning board hearing and the ordinance committee hearing. So what the ordinance committee looked at and accepted as the version of the petition they were going to review had many differences with the version that the planning board looked at, and as a result, when we looked at it and tried to explain the planning board's recommendations, we realized that some of the planning board's recommendations didn't really make sense anymore in context of the petition. So we decided that it was advisable, and this, like I said, I think is the first time we've done it, to have the latest version come back to the planning board to see if the planning board wanted to make any additional comments or suggestions, possibly modify parts of the recommendation, and we provided a copy of the recommendation to look at, so that the board's comments could be framed in a way that is maybe more helpful to the council.
I think one of the salient points that is helpful from a legal point of view is that once the original zoning petition is advertised, we can't make it more restrictive to property rights, again, without re-advertising. And so it can change over time, but we can't make the zone that it's going to affect larger so that property owners who weren't affected wouldn't have noticed that their property was affected. If we do anything like that, they have to start over again. But at the end of the day, the council, within that kind of restriction, can make changes and usually does.
And it's ultimately the city solicitor who decides.
Whether it's crossed that line.
Yeah.
So theoretically, that means an ordinance can come through the planning board. The planning board can offer a supportive recommendation. That ordinance can be substituted away and replaced with something, and so long as it is not more restrictive to property rights, that's fine.
If the city solicitor determined that it did not need to be re-advertised, yes, that could happen. In practice, I'd say it's much more common to have tweaks than wholesale substitutions.
Are you concerned about advertising or concerned about the planning board having the opportunity to comment on changes?
I'm concerned about the process. It seems like a violation of due process, maybe not in law, but certainly in spirit, to have the planning board make a recommendation on something that is different than what moves forward, or to have whatever the planning board makes a recommendation on change without the planning board's awareness of the change. Like, it bothers me a lot that this text is different than what's on the website. It bothers me both because it's different from what's advertised, but also bothers me because it suggests that the recommendations we're giving are to a document that may change, on a whim.
I've had a lot of experience with this, mostly in the town meeting context. And exactly what you're suggesting can indeed happen, because under the state law, the planning board is required to make a recommendation to the legislative body. But that recommendation does not bind the legislative body to follow the recommendation or to act upon what the planning board made the recommendation on, so long as it does not cross the line and go into areas that are beyond the scope of what was initially advertised and needs to be advertised again. So, as I say, I'm used to it in the town meeting context. Town meeting can do anything they want. And similarly, the city council can do whatever it wants, as long as it's within the four corners of what was advertised or what likely could be construed within the context of what was advertised. As Catherine said, if you go make it more restrictive and impact on property owners who should have been given an opportunity to be able to comment on it, then that's not allowed. But our recommendation, any planning board's recommendation, is simply this is what the planning board thinks, and you legislative body can take it from there.
I guess I would comment that it's the norm, not the exception, that the council applies their judgment. I mean, because the way I like to think about it is we're kind of focused on planning. The council is trying to be focused on the overall welfare of the city. And so commonly their last minute, amendments that are trying to get closer and closer to what the council believes is good for the city. And, you know, like the petition might expire at midnight and they might be voting at 11:59, and the amendment might have been on the floor for hours or minutes. It's just the way the system works. It's not.
And the way it's designed to work by state law.
Well, so I'm aware of the institutional differences between the city council and the planning board, and the fact that the city council is the legislative body. What bothers me is not that. What bothers me is what gets sent to the city council from us may be different from what we have seen. And so if the city council is receiving a recommendation from us about document A, and what the city council then sees and amends is document B, that seems inconsistent.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why Jeff has said, in this case, we are bringing it back to you because it is different, and we want to have our recommendation that it ultimately goes to the city council reflect the document that they're seeing. That's why we're having a second hearing of this.
Sure, that explanation makes sense.
I'd like to reply to two matters that Carol brought up.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not that much of a voice this evening. So the first, I think all of the kind of the red line marks about definitions, things, those are very important, and I think Carol has done a real service to make that very clear where those points are. I'm not concerned at all about the fire safety issue, though, because the zoning ordinance doesn't regulate fire safety. That's regulated by the fire code and the building code, and what's in the ordinance doesn't supersede what's in those documents. So we're not in allowing a areaway to be not counted for setback reasons doesn't mean that an unsafe condition as viewed from the other regulations would be allowed to exist. There's probably a gray area, judgment that has to be applied. Getting access by the fire department and the like. The fire department ultimately has to sign off on the building permit, right? So they have an opportunity to weigh in on that. And I guess I got the floor. I was hoping you guys would sort this out because it seems to be a mess. But I think I'm very much supportive of what Councilor Kelly is trying to do, and trying to make it possible to do this. And I may have reminded you that 30 or 40 years ago, I sat on a committee that resulted in the first accessory apartment ordinance, which was maybe used a handful of times in 25 years. So that is, I'm very clear that this is a kind of a legal minefield, and for the building department, and they're, so I think it's really important to get the language right and enforceable, and I don't think it's there yet. And I just thought of when Councilor Kelly showed me a picture of his house, and he said it was too small. I thought, oh, gee, it's sitting up, there must be a big basement under that. Under the Barrett Amendment, which now no longer counts basement space, would a house that formerly had more than 1,800 square feet because it had basement space that counted, now, under the Barrett Amendment, no longer have 1,800 square feet of space, and therefore wouldn't, so it would actually go backwards in terms of, so I think that's a question that has to actually be thought about because I don't think it's the intent that to make it more, to exclude structures that were previously included. And I don't know how to solve that. My solution to all of this is to say, okay, let's get ourselves clear about what are the principles, what are the intention, and then throw it all at Jeff and say, okay, you've got like a couple days to make it work, which is the usual thing we do to Jeff, right? But I mean, it needs that the level of thought to get it so that it's in a to achieve what Councilor Kelly is trying to do.
Oh, could I comment then?
Actually, Councilor Kelly was just asking to be recognized, so if you want to speak first.
Thank you. I would just want to reiterate what I said earlier was this was intended as a narrow change to the zoning code. Many of the items that Ms. O'Hare brought up were existing in the previous version. So I worry that if we look at every zoning change as an opportunity to fix everything that's relevant in the zoning code, I don't know where we go with that. And, you know, I appreciate your thoughtfulness on this, but I'll admit I'm sort of, I guess I'm frustrated with the process because I don't know how to work through that in the future. Is every change to anything going to require a complete reread of the existing language? And I guess if that's the case, then that's the case, and we'll just figure that out as we go forward. But I don't know what that does to the ability to make relatively minor changes to allow something to happen that we clearly wanted to happen in the past. So, thank you.
Ted.
Well, I want to be clear that I'm all in favor of the ADU concept and expanding it. I'm sorry that we did not address some of these issues last time, and you know, I think there are some language issues that need to be clarified, and there are some conceptual issues that need to be clarified. And I hope that, you know, Councilor Kelly has his opinion of what he is proposing and maybe what he thinks City Council wants, because, you know, for most of them, I don't really care one way or the other. I just want it to be clear to the building department what is allowed and to landowners what is allowed and what they can do. So I'm sorry if this gets boring again, but I definitely agree with the member of the public. There clearly is a definition of accessory building, and so if you have a definition in now 42212, accessory structure apartment, I really think it should be, excuse me, accessory building apartment, because building includes structure under our ordinance. Personally, if I were doing it, I would take out section 42212, create a new definition of just accessory structure apartment, put it up in the Article 2 definitions, and then it falls within the accessory structure, accessory building apartment, I think would then fall within the same conditions for a permit that applies to the others. But I have a lot of questions. So do I interpret this that it's all single family, two family, or an accessory building that were in existence as of February 1st? That date applies to all of them and not just to the accessory structure. So that's a question I have. And then is it, if we're talking about a one or two family building, that has to contain at least 1,800 square feet, subject to the issue that Hugh just raised. And I'm assuming, does that apply, that 1,800 square foot requirement apply just to an accessory unit within that building, or does that also apply if it's going to be in an accessory building? So if somebody wants to change a garage into an apartment, does it matter whether the principal building is 1,800 square feet or not? And I just think that has to be clarified. Similarly, if we're talking about the character of the building so that things don't change the neighborhood or the facade of the building or the appearance of the principal dwelling, I think all of that can apply to an accessory building apartment too, because obviously whatever they do in the accessory building, they want to make sure it fits in with both the principal building, or it may be different from the principal building already, and so we're not changing that. But if that's the case, then the BZA should be able to make a determination that there's little or minimal change.
But if you're converting a garage into a house, wouldn't you want to change at least the garage doors?
Well, yeah. Well, who knows? I mean, you and Tom might decide that the garage doors are a perfectly wonderful entryway and just leave them.
I recently saw a building on Beacon Hill that had, had garage doors appropriate to the street, even though it wasn't a garage behind it, because the historic district had said, but they should have been a garage.
I have a question about the number of accessory units you could have, So let's assume you've got a large 1 and 2 family house and you also have a garage or a carriage house. Can you have an accessory unit both in the house and another one in the carriage house or garage? I don't have any problem with doing it, but I want to, be clear on what people can do and what they can't do. And if for some reason you have 2 garages or 2 accessory structures on your lot, can you have them in 2 structures and in the house if necessary? Ownership was also a question. I think the ownership has been taken out of that, which, if you had, in my hypothesis of a house with an accessory structure and a garage with an accessory structure, could they then condominiumize the entire lot and put it in 2 or 3 ownerships? And, as I say, I don't really care, but I just want it to be clear what can be done. Really, those are. I had questions about the extending into the setback requirements, but if people are not concerned about that, because that's really a building code and a fire code issue, then I guess it's fine for zoning to allow it subject to these other requirements. That's basically my comments. I have no problem with the concept of it all. And and I guess my last question was, excuse me, if there's a accessory building apartment as I have it, do we apply, is it simply the 900 square feet? Or does it go back to 900 square feet or 35% of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling, whichever is less, or is it some percentage of the garage or the accessory structure that's taken into account? That comes about because of my idea of pushing everything together into the same listing that you would have to decide. And I guess another question, which is not addressed, it's not raised at all, should there be any square foot limitation on the size of an accessory unit? The concept that, an existing two-family may be converted to a single-family home with an accessory unit. I suppose you could have, what I think of as a two-family where the second and third floor is one unit, and maybe that becomes the accessory unit, and the first floor is the principal dwelling. Doesn't matter. Anyway, those were my issues, and yes, principal is spelled wrong in one location.
Steve?
Well, Ted has raised some of the technical issues. I guess I wanted to take a step back to the sort of policy issues for the moment. It seems to me that we have, two big policy concerns that we have expressed a number of times. Number one is providing affordable housing opportunities for more people in the city. And secondly, somehow making it possible for middle income people to live in the city and remain in the city. And it seems that in many instances, this sort of law addresses both of those issues and goals. For a middle-income people, a person who owns a home, the ability to make an additional unit may make that house more affordable and may make it possible for them to remain in the city. And of course, the additional unit itself presumably will be a more affordable unit. And so, bearing in mind that this really does address two desirable goals, assuming that the building code and fire code addresses a number of the technical and safety oriented issues, my initial reaction to this is, this serves a number of goals that we are trying to achieve, and therefore it seems to me that we should do everything possible to make these options available and possible as broadly and liberally as possible. So, I sort of start from that premise and then say, well, okay, what sort of issues arise that we really do have to address, and especially what sort of inconsistencies in our zoning code does this create, all of which I think are to some extent footnotes, but important footnotes to the basic and important policy goals. I think there are a lot of those little issues. We've heard some. One of them is ownership. Can these be condos? Is that a concern? Well, if you have one of these little condos in the basement, the good news is that, that might be a unit that would be more affordable for somebody that they wouldn't otherwise be able to purchase in the city. On the other hand, if we're trying to make affordable rental units to people, then we don't want to go in that direction. I'm not even sure to what extent we can be regulating ownership under state law. We can or we can't.
You can't regulate ownership.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
So if we go in this direction, it will be permissible to condo these units. And I don't think that there's anything we can do to prevent that. That is my understanding. Are you agreeing with that?
That's probably true unless it continued with the requirement that had been in the earlier draft that the owner had to reside in the principal dwelling.
Yeah, but even that's sort of a restriction on ownership, and I'm not sure that
Both of you are discussing something that's in the current zoning ordinance. So the current zoning ordinance has the clause 5 from the previous draft that the owners of the residence in which the accessory
Yeah,
dwelling unit is created.
yeah, I'm not sure it's it's enforceable under state law, but, okay. It's an issue in any event, and you know, it's still from our perspective, from a policy perspective, you know, is that something? Well, I think we should just make a decision one way or the other. Is it okay, you know, to condoize the unit, or is it not? You know, do we want it to be a rental unit, or is it okay to be a condo?
Can I throw into that?
You want to jump in there?
I just
or-
want, yeah,
Okay.
on that issue while it was fresh. So if this was a standalone, can that be sold as a condo unit? And, you know, that would, I don't know if that complicates it or. It's not
Yeah.
inside the structure,
Yeah.
it's a.
Listen,
So one of the things that makes this conversation difficult is really just we have to stay centered around what the meaning of an accessory unit is. So there's a distinction, and there has to be some distinction between what makes an accessory unit versus what makes it just another unit on the lot. So the definition of an accessory apartment is a separate dwelling unit that is within the same ownership as a principal dwelling. So, you know, if the zoning allowed you to create another unit on the lot, you know, you could condoize it, you could establish separate ownership, but the accessory unit has to remain accessory, or else it's just another principal dwelling unit.
So going off sort of on a tangent of that for a moment, you know, so you have, you know, one house in a 2-unit zoning district, but they're allowed to put a 3rd unit, an accessory unit, perhaps in the basement. Next door is a vacant lot where somebody wants to build a house. Can they only build 2 units, even though their neighbor, you know, it was permitted to put in a 3rd unit? Again, I think that if this, you know, in reference to the underlying policy notion, which is we're trying to create more affordable, smaller units. And if you look at everything, you know, through that lens, then why can't they put the 3rd unit in the new structure that they're building next door? I don't know. When I try to just keep focused on the policy that we're trying to achieve, on the one hand, I look at all these technical issues from the perspective of, well, let's make it as liberal as possible, you know, in order to enhance that policy. But then I would also ideally want it to be, you know, consistent and be able to, you know, enhance that policy in other situations, such as that vacant lot next door. You know, I have a bunch of other technical things, but it seems to me that if you look at each one of the technical things in the context of the policy that you're trying to achieve, it becomes a clearer lens through which to evaluate the technical issues.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. I mean, even, you know, when we talk about the size of the units, gosh, I mean, we've been talking about, you know, micro units and making them as small as possible in some of the new buildings. It's you know, again, if I'm looking at it through that lens, I'd be pretty liberal from a zoning perspective, so long as it complies with building code. I mean, that's just my general thing. I don't want to get into the details, because there are a lot of details that would really need to be worked out.
Lou?
One left on my list. One of the things I looked at was, what about multiple garage buildings? Not multiple buildings, but multiple garage building. You know, say a lot of our existing have 2, 3, 4 garages in the rear. Does that count? Do you get 1 unit, 4 units? If you put a second story on them, do you get 4 units in a 4-car garage? Just curious what where that would go.
And you know, you
And I think that the whole concept is great. I just worry about the bumps.
and I, you
Tom.
know, I think of this. Can I just
Steve,
come
no,
in?
you know,
Okay,
we're
go ahead.
going to give everybody a chance to be heard on this one first. Tom?
Okay, zoning's a blunt instrument, right? Planning, which is a discipline I'm qualified in and certainly experienced in through the work on this board, is imprecise. And I 100% agree with Steve that the policy that's detailed in the proposal, as we said before, is at the last time we heard this, is entirely consistent with planning policies that we work on here every Tuesday night, it seems. And so that's fantastic that it supports affordable housing and potentially for middle-income people to live here. I'm also impressed with the sausage making that Councillor Kelly and his other 8 colleagues are involved with. In fact, they picked up on a couple of things that did not occur to this zoning specialist relative to the height and other things. And this section of the ordinance is getting more precise, and I also appreciate Carol's contributions there. It probably will never be perfect, but you know, I spend my day living in the building code. I'm registered in 20 states, and I run a practice, and there is a public safety element there that is pretty severe and pretty reliable relative to issues of public safety. So with respect to Carol's concerns about that, we can have faith that that will be enforced and will provide safe spaces. I'm also a licensed builder in Massachusetts, so I know a little bit about how all of these things get done, and the building officials that we need to work with under those regulations aren't perfect, but they're pretty careful and pretty strict. So I rely on that. I rely on the good staff here that draft these ordinances. I rely on the city solicitor's office also to protect this. Let's recommend to the city council that this be adopted and adjusted as they see fit going forward. And let's test it. And it may come back for another amendment soon enough, but I'm ready to go on this.
Mary?
I don't have much to add. I too am in support of, moving forward on an accessory amendment. I think everybody does agree that it is a good use of property. It helps the city in a number of ways to expand its housing stock. The one concern I had was ownership versus occupancy, because it seemed to me, as Jeff said, for it to be a true accessory apartment, it should be owned by the person who owns the principal dwelling unit. But I don't think it's necessary for the person to actually live in the principal dwelling unit. And so I'm not really clear like what we're trying to say in this amendment right now. I keep going back and forth between, are we talking ownership, or are we talking occupancy, or are we talking both? So to me, that needs to just be clarified, and maybe legally it is. So if it meets the lawyer test, then I'm good with it. I do think, as Carol pointed out, and other members of the board, there are just a lot of little details, but that's for someone else to figure out. And as I said, in general, I think it's a good amendment. We should move forward.
Okay. Nico, you want to say anything on this? People who've already spoken will get another bite at the apple once everybody has
I'm trying to
spoken.
speak after Hugh.
Hugh already has spoken.
Oh, but his hand is up.
Yeah, as has been Ted's and as has been Steve's.
Great,
Everybody
sorry.
will get their chance to say their piece.
Sorry, I was trying to defer. So I am also in favor of accessory dwelling units as a concept. But I have the same reservation that I had the last time this was before us, that I don't think that this language the language of the current petition will help homeowners or achieve the goals that Councillor Kelly has laid out, which I think are laudable goals. I think to the extent that a homeowner has a accessory apartment or accessory dwelling unit in mind, they should be able to build their or designate part of the home as an accessory apartment without having to hire a lawyer. I agree with that goal. So what this process has raised for me as just a red flag is the existing 4.22 is poorly written. And so I think what Councillor Kelly is running into is the current language of the existing ordinance is not good. And he's trying to make it better, but he's making it better by continuing all the not good parts of the existing ordinance, which I don't like, because it's not good. So I'm sort of stuck in thinking, well, is it better to sort of support this incremental change, or is it better to come up with an ordinance that makes a lot of sense? So I agree with Ms. O'Hare's criticisms of the existing ordinance that uses new terms, that doesn't fit all of the existing definitions in Section 2 of the zoning ordinance. And I think those her redlining through the existing ordinance would be a good improvement for us to move forward with as a petition in its own right, in addition to thinking about the goals that Councillor Kelly has. But I just can't vote to support something like this when the language is just not there. So, for example, the original petition had a change to the language in Section 2, which is where all the definitions are, as well as amendment to Section 4, which is where the current accessory apartment language is. The petition we're looking at right now has this 4.22.12, which for some reason is between point 1 and point 2, and not 10 sections later, where you would expect to find 12. But it has a definition, so you would expect that to be in Section 2 of the zoning ordinance, not in Section 4.22.12. So, it's like that needs to be in Section 2. And this is where the source of my questions about what is the language we're voting on comes from. Because I think this would not be a good law. This would be an incredibly confusing law. But I think you can move things around. You could clarify the language. It could be better. And so my question is coming from a perspective of, if we vote to recommend this, with changes in language, I would want the City Council to receive this with that recommendation attached to it, so that they can know, okay, this is what we looked at, as opposed to this thing that keeps sprouting new amendments, that weren't even on the website. So all in all, it just seems like I agree that we could benefit from having a lawyer on staff that can just read through the legal petitions that we receive and evaluate them. I think it would be helpful just up front to say this is the existing language, this is what is being changed, so that we know that the existing language, for example, says an accessory apartment is located within and under the same ownership as a single-family detached dwelling and designed for the occupancy of a single family, whereas this language says an accessory structure apartment is located with and under the same ownership as the primary dwelling per Section 4.22.1 and designated for the occupancy of a single family. So there are 3 changes right there, and I can't explain why any of them are in the new ordinance. And, all of those changes could have an effect. So first, it says the primary dwelling per Section 4.22.1. I don't... I'm all in all just confused by the petition, given how confusing the existing 4.22.1 and Section 2 is, and it would just help to have, we have an accessory apartment section of the ordinance. You can do this, but there's currently a minimum square feet of lot requirement. There's currently not been substantially enlarged since built, which we criticized last time. And I criticized it under the impression that Councillor Kelly had invented it, without realizing, oh no, that's the existing law. So, I think that I made a uneducated recommendation last time, not realizing what the existing ordinance was, and it would help in the future for petitions like this to have some legal guidance about what is exactly being changed and how it would affect existing law.
Okay, thank you. Ted, do you want to add anything now?
Yeah, could I add it?
Yep.
I think we have to look at the historic background of, which I think was adopted probably in their families are smaller and they're living in big houses. Or to Heath, large houses. 422 was adopted to allow people with large houses to move. I think we're looking at it with a different perspective of wanting to create more housing. It is a bizarre that 4.12 is consistent with how numbering is done through it, where when you're within a subsection, it'll be 1, then it'll be 12, then it might be very odd, and plus it's entire zoning.
That may be true, but the existing Article 4 has none of that. And
I know, but I was just glancing through some other stuff. Always driven me crazy. Really nothing further right now.
Steve? Okay. Ted. Ted. Looked right at you and your nameplate and called you Ted instead of Hugh. I apologize.
Way too young to do that. Yeah.
I'm not ready to own that.
So I really couldn't agree more with Nico's point that we really need to fix the accessory pair section so that it makes sense. A footnote on the original intent. In addition to what Ted said, there was the focus of Cornelia Wheeler, who was behind it, was her friends who were widows living in big houses in West Cambridge, and hoping they could actually get some nice young man to move in and sort of take care of, stuff and be a presence in the house to provide more security. That was really what initiated the discussion. I think, so on the height paragraph 5, which has shown up, it's a response to the definition of height in the ordinance, which says height is measured from the mean grade of land adjoining the structure to the highest point of the roof. So if you dig out a stairwell next to the building, the mean grade goes down by whatever small increment. And so you don't want the building department to bounce it up to a variance if that should happen. But I hate the wording because it's talking about, and I'm not sure I can offer better wording, but I think what you want the building department to do is to disregard any such change in grade being used for egress stairs. Now, that may not be legally tenable from their point of view. And I would make a suggestion on the question of number of units and number of structures, and say that maybe the way to start is to say you can add one unit, accessory unit, into each structure that exists on the lot. And so a multiple garage is indeed just a single structure. And there may be a house that's got 2 independent garages. There probably is somewhere in the city. And if that turns into 2 units, is the world going to fall? The idea is to try to find something that's simple and straightforward, accomplishes what's trying to be accomplished for most of the situations, and is clear. So I would suggest that might be a way to come down, not because it applies to every circumstance, but as the chart in our book indicated, these things are getting permitted by variance anyway. And maybe I'll make one further step backwards. A long time ago, I think I was still on the zoning board, we tried to craft amendments to the existing non-conforming building sections of the ordinance, which would reduce the number of kind of frivolous cases that have come before the zoning board. Yes, I see Tom nodding his head. To me, regulating new windows or relocated windows in a side lot, which wasn't part of the ordinance at that time, it's still, if you find that the zoning board always grants relief, then why don't you make it as of right, or at least a special permit? So we should rewrite the entire ordinance, not just this paragraph. And I assume that somewhere in the work plans that are either laid out or in the back of Iram's mind, that's a task that could be put, and it has its own priorities, which probably are not as high as many other priorities.
Yes.
Can I take my time back now?
Yes, you can.
I want to sort of focus on general issues rather than the details, though I wanted to start off with one little detail. And that is, we talked about being able to put in stairs in setback areas, and that might raise fire code issues, and we'll rely on the fire department on those issues. But those are primarily issues on the side lot lines. And the front lot, however, will not be primarily a fire code issue. That would probably be more an aesthetic issue, putting a staircase in the front yard. And I wouldn't necessarily ban that, but it's something that it seems to me requires some sort of design review. And as I thought of that, I generalized the point that there may be many changes that we're talking about here that are perfectly fine from a zoning perspective, but who knows how they'll play out from a design aesthetic perspective. And so that led me to think that, ideally in my world, that when somebody creates new units in an existing structure, we certainly don't want it coming back to the planning board every time, and it may comply with building code issues, but I wish there would be some sort of design review. And there are some districts in the city, such as Mid-Cambridge, where there might well be a design review, though I'm not sure that these things would rise to the level of requiring a design review even there. But just in general, I wish there would be some sort of design, aesthetic oriented review of the changes that might be made under this ordinance. And hopefully such design reviews wouldn't ban or undermine the possibility of these changes, but it would be an opportunity to have some input into those changes in order to achieve the policy goals, but in a way that is aesthetically acceptable to the city generally, to the neighbors, and so forth. So it concerns me a little bit that this would be happening without any sort of design review. And then just another general comment on the drafting itself, which sometimes is confusing, sometimes isn't addressing some of the issues that we wish would address. I'm not sure who drafted the amendment and how such proposed amendments get drafted, but I kind of wish, actually, that at a point that we're at right now, that we are able to discuss and propose certain policy objectives. We have a proposed drafting, but I wish it would then go to staff and have staff, including the city attorney, you take a look at these things. Okay, I understand the policy objectives, but now I'm going to fine-tune the drafting to make sure that it's clear and consistent. It seems to me that would be a really worthwhile function, different than the way we usually do it. But gosh, our code is confusing enough without adding inconsistencies and confusion. I would love to see our city council, not city council, city attorneys, help us along in these zoning amendments.
Yes.
Do you want to take it? No, I was just, since this has come up a few times already, I thought I'd just point out quickly that staff will look at this recommendation, and if the planning board asks us to, we will work on drafting amended language and substitute language. We do that routinely. In this case, I think there were substantive. So I think the helpful part of this conversation for us, and we do appreciate pointing out that there's issues with the clarity of the language that need to be resolved, is to really help settle some of the more outstanding substantive issues about the petition, because part of the issue with the zoning language and its clarity is it doesn't give us a good understanding of what the intent is supposed to be. So if there were discussion on these questions, which I think Ted framed several of these questions about how many accessory apartments should be allowed on a lot, and Hugh gave some commentary on that. What should be I think part of what should be are there any limitations in terms of minimum unit size, maximum unit size, minimum or maximum size of the structure existing on the lot? And I think one of the most important things is how this relates to the base zoning requirements. I think it's made fairly clear that the intent is to allow accessory apartments to be built and not to be counted against the maximum total number of units that are allowed on the lot. But how does that relate to floor area? Can you add floor area to a building to add an accessory apartment? I imagine if you did allow that and it were exempt from other zoning limitations, you'd probably see a lot of enlarged buildings to create accessory apartments. Is that something that the board wants, thinks that is supportable as a way to encourage these kinds of units? Those are the kinds of questions that I think are left a little bit unclear from the petition in terms of what's intended. I think in terms of the in terms of these issues about window wells into setbacks. There's, I think, a broader issue because that's something that has come up in cases specifically where accessory apartments have been created in basements, but also in all kinds of cases where additional living space has been created in basements, not just additional accessory apartments or anything else. So, is the intention just to narrowly focus on accessory apartments in basements, or is it to try to expand some provisions more broadly, which actually belong more in Article 5 of the zoning ordinance, where we deal with dimensional standards? And then the other piece that I wanted to raise was the planning board did include in their recommendation the question about flood risk, and we did work. We actually did meet with the law department and ISD and DP and Public Works to review this issue. We got some comments from the Department of Public Works. We looked at a modified version of the zoning that applies in the basement housing overlay district, which was offered as a suggestion. It could be that all or part of that could be recommended as part of the standards for or the review criteria for an accessory apartment if it's the basement level. But that's another substantive issue that I think is important for the planning board to help give some guidance on. And if the intent is clear, it's a lot easier for staff to work with the solicitor's office and inspectional services and make sure the language is written in a way that it will be interpreted consistent with the intent.
So, Jeff, you expand and confirm my point. Then, if we start with our policy objectives, you start drafting, you start running into all sorts of questions and issues, that we were not clear about. Then you come back to us and say, these are the open issues. From a policy perspective, please make decisions. And then, the issues are addressed, and you can incorporate it into the drafting. Gosh, without this back and forth process, I mean, we have a proposed ordinance like this, which is, on the verge of being enacted, and all of those issues remain unclear and unresolved. I think this sort of back and forth process with the solicitor and with staff is essential to the whole process.
Can I jump in? So I completely agree with everything you've just said, and would just like to add, I think I'll give my attempt at what I imagine is the planning board's consensus about policy goals given what this change does, and to help guide what CDD and the solicitor's office does. And so anyone else on the planning board, feel free to step in if I'm not speaking on your behalf for this. But so change 1 is the existing ordinance says that the BZA can grant a special permit to create an accessory apartment so long as the dwelling has not been substantially enlarged since built. I think we opposed that language last time it was presented. The new draft eliminates that language. I think that's good. So that's change 1. Change 2, the existing ordinance says that you can't have an accessory apartment when the lot, unless the lot contains at least 5,000 square feet. The new language does not have that restriction. I think that is a good change. The existing language does not allow an accessory apartment in a garage. Councilor Kelly has said this is an explicit goal of the new language that it can be built in a garage. I think that's a good change. The old language says that the owners of the residence must continue to occupy at least one of the dwelling units, and the owner has to submit a notarized letter saying as much. This does not have that requirement, but it remains part of the definition of an accessory apartment. And so long as that existing definition doesn't change, then I think we're on board. The existing language allows the BZA to impose conditions, including off-street parking limitations. Councilor Kelly has said one of his goals is to eliminate the parking requirement. The new language did not have a parking requirement. I think that is a good change. There are a bunch of new additions in this 4.22.2, as well as this 4.22.12, but particularly 4.22.2, that just doesn't speak zoning to me. It talks about lot per dwelling unit calculation. I think it should probably be lot area. It speaks of FAR calculations. I think it should be gross floor area. But those aren't policy things. Those are more language things. But as far as the policy goals, it seems like, it's eliminating the substantial enlargement requirement. It's eliminating the minimum 5,000 square feet of lot requirement. It's allowing accessory apartments on a garage. It's eliminating the notary requirement, and it's eliminating the off-street parking requirement. If that's all this does, then I'm on board.
That was a fantastic summary. Thank you for doing that. Does anyone have any additions or want to separate themselves from what Nico just said or take exception to any of it?
I just have a question. On
Yes.
the garage and the parking requirement. So if there's a two-family house that currently has a garage with 2 parking spaces in it, it's meeting zoning, shall we say, then if the owner wants to convert that garage, what happens? Does he or she have to get a variance for lack of parking with their own unit? Or, I just am not sure how it works.
New language, there is no parking requirement. So
For the new unit. So they would still have to provide 2 parking spaces. However, there's no requirement that they be provided in the garage. One could park those cars directly in front of the garage, presumably, and still fulfill the parking requirement.
So, Madam Chair, so the
Yeah.
so the parking could be provided in another way, as the chair was suggesting, or reducing the parking requirement is a special permit from the Board of Zoning Appeals, so that could also be applied for at the same time.
I have just a couple of comments. First of all, I wish there would be an assistant city manager in charge of unintended consequences. Because while I agree with everything that Nico says, the way these things go is, usually there are unintended consequences, and somebody, a staff person, really, needs to think it through and not just be focusing on the goals that we're trying to achieve and that we think that this will achieve, but also think through what some of the other consequences might be that we hadn't really focused on or anticipated. And it seems there are always such consequences, and then neighbors get angry about it.
It's a special permit process, so they will have notice and be able to come and weigh in. But Hugh?
So I've been thinking about the areaway and the height. Now, this is all in the context that this is a special permit being given by the zoning board. So could not language be written that says a waiver of the height could be given by the zoning board, provided the actual existing structure doesn't get it any closer to the sun, and that would explicitly allow them to vary the setback rules to allow for areaway stairs under the special permit they're giving, which might otherwise be a variance. Is that a legal possibility?
I mean, that would be I think that would be a clearer way of framing the proposal. This is a provision of the zoning which I tend to look at it as kind of, as you said, with regard to Article 8, it's taking something that would normally be a variance and moving it into a special permit. So the complication, and again, going back to sort of unforeseen consequences, is to think about what are the kinds of changes that might need to be made in association with a project like this, and how many of those, or how much of that relief can be granted through a special permit rather than a variance. So those are 2 issues, and then another, I mentioned before the issue of floor area. How do you count how do you count the amount of floor area that's being used, whether it can be enlarged in the service of creating an accessory apartment or not, if it exceeds what's allowed under the base zoning district, because the most recent version of the language says accessory apartments are exempt from FAR calculations to determine allowable gross floor area of a lot, which means that creating an accessory apartment anywhere on a lot could, as a result, create a lot more additional floor area that could be built, or a little, or some amount, depending on what's actually there to begin with. So those are things that getting back around to the point, the way that's usually framed in the zoning is to say, through this special permit process, the BZA may grant approval for variations that would otherwise require a variance.
That sounds good.
And that might, if it could be stated in a very principled manner. So any variance that comes up that's related to the creation of the accessory apartment would be within the ability of the zoning board to evaluate and grant as a special permit.
The thing is, we frequently hear with special permits that if you comply with the specific criteria in the code, that you're entitled to the granting of the special permit. And I guess it gets back to this the design review concept that I raised earlier. In situations where putting an entrance in the front yard may be objectionable. If there's no particular rule that you can't do that, and there's no design review incorporated in the process, then you're going to be entitled to that special permit, even if it's something that we would think is really objectionable, and something that could be remedied. So I wish there were some sort of review in this process, whether it be from a neighborhood conservation district or something where it isn't just an ordinary entitlement. Also, the notion that the FAR or the gross floor area doesn't count. I don't know. Is there anything in here which says that we're only talking about basement space? I don't think so. And is there anything that says that this unit can't be, a 2,000 foot unit? It's a funny sort of thing. That there are very few limitations on what this unit can be, and we're not going to count it as gross floor area. Again,
hold on just a second, Steve. The language here clearly says that the apartment can't be more than 900 square feet or 35% of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling. So, so no, you couldn't.
A standalone also?
I believe that this refers to both, yes.
Well, no, it doesn't, because now it says.
Oh, excuse me, you're right, Ted. Now, if it's a standalone, it's just the 900 square feet.
Which,
that's a house.
Got 1,000 square foot garage, and you're limited to a 900 square foot accessory, and you've got 100 square feet that's just floating around as nothing. So, I mean, I don't know, I think dealing with the square footage is an issue. I mean, it's mostly for the freestanding structures, how large can the unit be? And, I don't
Okay.
Can I respond to
Yeah.
Steve? So under special permit criteria, there are two kind of design review provisions. 10.43C, continued operation or development of adjacent uses as permitted in the ordinance would not be adversely affected, and that for other reasons the use would impair the integrity of the district or zoning district. So the zoning board does in fact do design review. At least it did in our service. They don't have a staff. It's not to a standard of the neighborhood conservation district, and I'm a firm believer that every neighborhood should have a neighborhood conservation district to provide that kind of thing. But it does fall under, there's words there that you can use to do design review. And I would say, a fire escape in the front yard impairs the integrity of the district. I would have. Yeah, of other considerations. Right, and what will happen in practice is that it will come up on our list of cases. We'll look at the thing, and if it looks really awful, we will try to drag our, design staff into trying to help make it better.
So, can I just say something to provide explicit guidance to CDD staff? So it appears, based on what Jeff just said and reading this 4.22.2, that if you have an 1,800-foot dwelling and you carve it up into a 900-foot accessory apartment and then a 900-foot what previously existed, the accessory apartment doesn't count toward the gross floor area of the dwelling or of the lot, and so that may be maxed out at 900 square feet. But now the original dwelling now has 900 more square feet that they can build on, because they essentially just traded away 900 square feet of the dwelling, and I don't think that it's any of our goal to allow that to happen. So any language that doesn't allow that to happen would be good.
Actually, under yours.
Regardless of whether my reading is correct, I think we share that goal.
Yes.
Okay.
Hypothesis, and under the language here, your accessory.
Oh, because that's okay. Fine. Whatever.
Your point's still valid.
We're always going to have that issue. How large can it be?
Well, but I think Nico's point is you shouldn't be allowed to take to get the benefit of that and then you get additional benefit.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But this falls again under the general rubric of unintended
Yes.
consequences, which
and so
I,
it's
I
one
wish
we've
staff
actually
would go through.
anticipated and said, don't want that.
Right, so
But which ones have we not anticipated yet?
put it in the schema of one of the things that the special permit can deal with.
Right.
It's basically legalizing the permitted square footage.
Correct.
Says it doesn't count, it's just you have the ability to legalize it.
Okay. In the interest of moving us to some kind of conclusion here that staff can work with, and I want to first say that I completely agree with Nico's recommendation that the language we're reviewing tonight needs to be attached to what the planning board forwards, because this has been enough of a moving target that to the extent we're talking about the ordinance, they need to know what we're talking about. I also think Nico did a great job summarizing kind of the overall policy goals that the board, there's consensus on the board that we all agree should be achieved, and that we appreciate the goals Councillor Kelly has articulated and his efforts to use the ordinance to make incremental progress towards increasing affordable and middle income housing stability and units in the city. That being said, both for reasons that exist in the existing ordinance and in challenges with the drafting in the changes, there isn't consensus that the language should be adopted as written, that it needs a lot of technical help, and we heartily support both CDD staff and the city solicitor working with the proponent to better clarify the language to achieve the goals that we have just discussed. Does that sound like it summarizes what we've just, and to add Steve's, and to think of all the things we haven't thought of and bring any of those that we need to opine on back to us as necessary. Good?
How much time do we have to do this? I mean, obviously, as much as it takes is probably the answer, and if it has to be refiled, probably not
It
bad
wouldn't
policy.
be the first time.
It would not be a bad policy if the whole language is clarified.
Yeah.
To put it all forward at once. So perhaps Councillor Kelly can look at this meeting as actually a positive step forward, that we're starting to take some ownership of this issue, and we're asking for the staff help, and that's being offered as it ordinarily would be.
Aram, did you want to say anything?
No, not really.
Not now. It's moved on.
Everything's been said. I had only wanted to speak up on behalf of my colleagues in the city solicitor's office to say that they are actually intimately involved in every zoning discussion that the city is involved in. So we should not have any fear that they are not participating.
Could I?
Yeah.
Could I add to what you summarized? I would be willing, and maybe I wonder if the whole board is, to go along with Hugh's suggestion that there could only be one accessory unit in the per structure.
Is there support for that concept?
Yeah.
Just one question. In multifamily structures, does this apply to multifamily structures?
Single and two family.
Yeah, I mean, we already have in one district where we're permitting, I guess, new units. They're not really accessory units in the basements. And this is sort of funny. It sort of intersects from a policy perspective, which what we're doing here.
I mean,
when they permitted that, there were multiple units in the basements.
so another thing to throw in the pile is, on my street now, almost all the three-deckers are condos.
Yeah, I was gonna raise that.
And so each individual unit does not reach the size standard, but the overall structure does. There might be some ability to create new accessory units, but the ownership would be impossible. Maybe we just have to say, we don't know, it's too hard to do from a legal point of view right now to anticipate it, so we'll just.
Well, legally, you would only do it in a condo, way I read this is it would be single family, two family, or an accessory structure. So in a triple decker, for example, you're not going to do it in the basement because it's not a single or two family house. But you could do it in a pre-existing garage. But using my own triple decker as an example, you'd only have the ability to do that if you had all three owners agree. And if all three owners have agreed on it and are coming forward in support of the proposal, I think it's perfectly fine. The likelihood of that happening seems next to nothing. But I think it would be fine. If it could be achieved, it would be fine.
And sorry, Madam Chair, I just point out, 'cause this has come up around again. So if you look at the definition, it was an amended definition of accessory structure apartment. It's on the same lot as a single or two family home.
So you couldn't even do it in a. Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you all. I took a zillion notes, and that's what I did last time as well. And when I sat down with Patrick and reviewed my notes, and we changed the proposed ordinance, we went to the ordinance committee and offered those new changes as a substitution for the original proposal. So the original proposal that you had all commented on was there, and I explained to the other ordinance committee members that based on the input of the planning board, I thought that we had a better ordinance for the ordinance committee to consider, and recommended that we adopt by substitution a new proposal. That's exactly what I'm going to do this time. So they're going to get, the ordinance committee is going to get either something that incorporates your changes or your suggested changes, something that doesn't, but a side document or explanation of issues that I think you brought up that for whatever reason I disagree with or I think are already covered in the ordinance. And we will start the conversation there, because otherwise we'd be talking about something without your wisdom, and I think that would be a shame. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think for exactly that reason, we want our recommendation attached to the document we reviewed, so there's no lack of clarity on that. All right. To go back to this question of one unit in each structure, given that it is only, despite my bad memory, only on lots for single and two-family homes, is everyone okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so with that, my summary, Ted's amendment to include the limitation that Hugh had proposed, that there be only one unit per structure. Are we okay with forwarding that recommendation?
Yes.
Lou? Oh, that's a thumbs up, not a question.
Well, yeah, I have a question.
Oh, of course you do.
Of course I do. So, I'm sorry, I thought we were talking about sending it to staff and having staff work on some of the stuff of consistencies, unintended consequences, and so forth. But now you're suggesting that we not do that and send it back to the council?
We are recommending in our recommendation to the council, we are offering that they work with staff to get the technicalities and all of this right. But this is a recommendation to council. Yeah.
I kind of wish that we could recommend to council sort of we support the policy, but we're not there yet on the drafting.
I think that is what we are saying. That is exactly what we are saying.
One speaker at a time.
That's what we're saying, Steve, is that we can't support it as written. Here are all the policies we do support, and we are asking staff to work with the proponent to.
No, good, I'm with you.
Okay. All right. Does someone want to make a motion in favor of forwarding the recommendation to council?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? All right. We'll take a really quick break and then come back. We'll have updates from CDD and then talk about Envision Cambridge. Thank you.
I just want to remind the board, and during the adjournment, that we're in this position because of the Barrett petition in 2015, where the
We'll take a couple minutes to hear updates from Iran.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your flexibility in letting us do this update late. So I'm not going to talk about, obviously, tonight's meeting because we are well underway. I actually want to ask the board that for your next scheduled meeting is April 2nd. This is weird. Is April 2nd, and the only item we have is a Board of Zoning Appeals case. Jeff, do you recall what the case is? We don't have anything else, and wanted to ask the board if you want to meet or whether you would prefer to not have the meeting.
So I'll say this, and then if I get this wrong, somebody can wave at me. So I believe this is the Harvard Divinity School case on Francis Ave. They're proposing an expansion to the building. and that case is, I think, scheduled to be heard April 11th. So, so next week is the only planning board meeting between now and then.
Might want to talk about that
So,
one.
anyone on the board feel strongly that we need to weigh in on that? So it's an addition that has been under discussion, and the subject of much community debate, and as Tom was muttering and alluded to, a beloved tree was a concern during some of the discussion. There has been a lot of public meetings about this.
The New York Times article, and there's a tree moratorium.
There is.
It's a tree moratorium.
Yeah. So it is. There would not be a lack of opportunity for public input on this particular issue, building issue, if we did not hold up a meeting, but they would not hear our personal opinions and the sense of the board.
We could go to the zoning board.
That's true. Anyone who felt strongly, as Tom notes, could go to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
Or we could submit a written.
Or you could submit a written comment. My sense is the board would be okay doing that and not holding a meeting just for that purpose.
Fantastic. So with that, no, I just meant that as in fantastic that we have a decision. I always love to see you every Tuesday. However, the next 2 Tuesdays conflict with some city council meetings that have been scheduled. Potentially. And so April 9th and 16th, we will not be having board meetings. And the next board meeting will be April 23rd in that case. And there are 2 public hearings that are scheduled for that date. There's 23 May Street, which is a special permit project, and then 57 JFK, which is an amendment to an existing planning board special permit. April 30th is also a date that we are holding, although we don't have anything on the agenda yet, but I suspect that some of the, it may be getting to time for some of the things to come back that the board has discussed but not made a decision on. So in terms of related items at the council, tomorrow, the Ordinance Committee is holding their hearing on the GRIPPO petition, which is the hotel use in the Industry B district. On April 2nd, the Ordinance Committee will be hearing their next discussion on the accessory apartment zoning, which the board just held. And on April 3rd, they have a hearing on, the Ordinance Committee again has a hearing on the Cambridge side PUD 8 petition. April 9th, which is Tuesday, the council might have a roundtable discussion on the affordable housing overlay proposal. They haven't finalized this. It was on the agenda for this past Monday, but one of the councillors exercised their charter right, and so it will come up for discussion next Monday, the 1st. April 16th, the Housing Committee, the Council's Housing Committee will hold another hearing on the affordable housing overlay. That's at 6 o'clock, and that's the other thing that conflicts with planning board time. April 23rd, which is a planning board meeting, but earlier in the day at 3 o'clock, the Health and Environment Committee of the City Council will hold a hearing on the city's zero waste master plan and ways to reduce single-use plastics. April 24th at noon, the Economic Development and University Relations Committee of the Council will hold a discussion on concepts related to an ordinance that they're interested in, which would require registration of vacant properties, particularly vacant storefronts. One last item, which is, sorry, I missed it. On April 23rd at 1 p.m. The Council's Transportation and Public Utilities Committee is hosting a petition, having a hearing on a petition about whether there can be additional regulation applied to transportation network companies, so Uber, Lyft, and such. So I think those are the things in April that the Planning Board would be most interested in. Tonight, right now, we're probably winding down a community meeting around looking at parking on First Street, and this is related to the disposition of the First Street parking garage parking spaces that in the context of the courthouse special permit, which the Planning Board had reviewed. So there's going to be a lot of discussion for some time yet on that. Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
A long recitation of City Council subcommittee meetings, and I don't go to such meetings because I think it's a bad policy. I think first, unless my own personal interests might be involved in the matters under discussion, because I think it might be interpreted by the council that I was speaking for this board, and if I hadn't actually benefited from all of your advice, my speaking might not be as informed as it should be. So therefore, the only solution I seem to think of is to not attend such meetings. And I just wanted to check that if that was other people's understanding.
I have to say I personally haven't given it as much thought as you have, and mostly out of sheer exhaustion, I do not attend the subcommittees. But I think your point is well taken. Whenever we are attending such meetings, if particularly, I would say if someone speaks, it would be important to clarify that you're not, the planning board hasn't weighed in on this, and you're not speaking on behalf of the board if you do attend.
I'm just afraid they can't hear that message.
Understood. That there is always that danger. But at the same time, I certainly, if somebody had a personal interest in a matter,
of course,
it's you're welcome as any citizen to attend any of these. So, yeah.
If I could ask a question, is the enumeration of these meetings at all helpful for the board? Because I do it mostly because I think you'd be interested in knowing what's going on at the city, but if it's not, then I could. It is. Okay.
I think it is useful, especially to the extent they're acting on things we've already recommended on, or that will eventually be coming before us, because as Lou notes, videos are available. There is other coverage. We can certainly read reports to have that information, even if, like me, you have neither the time nor energy to attend all of the meetings. I also think, some of these things, like, for instance, registration of vacant property, might not come before us, but at some point I'd be interested in hearing what was concluded and whether or not that's going on and how it impacts how we think about, for instance, retail zoning. Those are the kinds of things that's helpful for me, at least, to know are going on elsewhere in the city.
It would be great also, actually, if you could just send an email listing those meetings, that would be of interest, because I hear it when you announce it, and
I agree exactly with what you said, and that's sort of been my policy not to go to anything, but I feel somewhat uncomfortable saying that if some board member feels very strongly about some particular matter at some other committee, that they should have any, I don't know, not qualms about not going, but I think they should be feel that they can go as long as they make it clear that they are speaking solely on behalf of themselves and not on behalf of the board.
If that was not clear in what I said, I appreciate you clarifying it. That is absolutely what I'm saying.
You know, I certainly think that we can clarify that we're speaking personally and not officially. But I think that we have a special perspective on the city, and you know, it doesn't need to be an issue that we have a personal interest on, you know, affecting our block or something.
Yeah.
I think that we can have valuable input in these procedures.
Okay.
Let me
Yep.
add one more curiosity about this, though. Not so much that. I have noticed in my watching of these videos, there are quite a few quotes that come out of the planning board that the counselors like to refer to. So, as me, just so you know, you are being quoted.
Fair enough. They too can watch the videos of us and determine the veracity of any of those quotes. So, Hugh, thank you for bringing it up. Everyone should choose what meetings they go to, and just if you go, make it clear you're there on behalf of the board or not, as the case may be. Moving on. Thank you.
Thank you all. My name is Gary Chan. I'm a neighborhood planner with community development, here to give an update on the Alewife component of Envision Cambridge. So I'll start with a brief overview of the where the planning process as that's wound down, and then Eric Thorkelson will take over and present on the urban design guidelines that are in development that will support the plan recommendations that have come out. We'll also have a few moments to pause for any questions, so feel free to let us know at those points. Sorry, this clicker's not working. So I thought what I'd do is give a brief overview as far as what the conditions were in the Alewife area that this planning process was responding to. As you can see, much of the area is developed and characterized by quite a bit of pavement. Although it's surrounded by large prominent open spaces, much of the district itself, especially within the quadrangle area, which was a particular focus of this planning process, it lacks connectivity to these spaces and connectivity internally in general. It's an area that is, particularly in the quadrangle, characterized by disparate ownership, which obviously is not as apparent here, but is important to note as something that informed or was a part of our consideration in looking at this area. The Alewife district is also largely automobile oriented. Traffic was raised as a concern throughout this process, and as you know, major automobile thoroughfares are both a part of this district and serve users originating from outside of Cambridge and heading destinations outside of the area as well. These thoroughfares serve as barriers both to the district and to movement within the district as well. And as within the area, there are areas that are developed according to a more suburban model of development than is seen elsewhere in Cambridge. The area is not particularly pedestrian friendly, as you can see, or to other active modes as well. This partly relates back to the auto-oriented design, and things like the relative lack of street trees and plantings, and building orientation and how they interface with the sidewalk are a part of this as well. In other areas, their pedestrian infrastructure is a bit lacking. And large portions of the area, again, are characterized by lower scale development surrounded by largely paved areas, often surface parking. But as this board is certainly familiar with, more recent residential development has also been characterized by a larger scale with longer continuous facades along the sidewalks as well. And underpinning all of this is the area's vulnerability to the risks of climate change, both in terms of potential heat island effects as well as vulnerability to flooding, especially as we look further along toward 2070. These are all part of the range of conditions that through the planning process, working with the Alewife Working Group, working over several public meetings and other approaches to outreach, the planning process looked to address in kind of the context that this visioning for the future of Alewife was working within. The aim for the district was to create one that is a mixed-use district, one that has a sense of place and a sense of identity, one that is connected and integrated to the rest of the city, not just in terms of physical connections and movement to the district, but also socially connected to the rest of Cambridge as well. One that feels it's a part of the broader city. Climate resilience and sustainable transportation were, of course, key goals of this process, as well as looking at a continuous open space network to help not just bring recreational opportunities here, but also to again connect the Alewife area to the city more broadly. So a key part of this was looking at the existing street network and opportunities to fill out that network to improve circulation within, particularly the quadrangle area, but also looking a bit beyond as well. The thinking behind this, in addition to providing for improved vehicular access, is to take a look at these as complete streets to improve both pedestrian and bicycle connectivity throughout the area as well. Another component of this, as I mentioned, is expanding access to open spaces within the both external to the district as well as within the area themselves or itself. Looking at both, again, the opportunity to provide additional recreation or passive use, but also to leverage them as opportunities to connect within the district. And altogether, these contribute to an area that is better connected and supportive of more sustainable modes of transportation, and better integrate the with areas outside of the Alewife district as well. And then another aspect of the plan recommendations, of course, is around land use and urban form, some of which will then inform zoning for the area, as well as the guidelines that Eric will discuss in a bit. The last time we had presented around the Alewife process to the planning board, we'd walk through kind of sub-district by sub-district the proposed land uses and anticipated impacts. For that, I won't get into that level of detail today, but I do kind of want to give an overview as far as the proposed land uses that are thought of for each of the kind of sub-areas within the Alewife district. So actually going backwards on this list from 7 on up, some of the areas 7, 6, and 5, the Parkway areas, the Whittemore Ave, and the Triangle areas are areas that we don't really expect to see, or as part of the planning process, don't anticipate kind of significant change from the allowable use that's currently there. I think throughout the process, what we'd seen that kind of what was there, what's allowable, is fairly consistent with the kind of broader vision for the Alewife district. As part of the shopping center, that was an area that was looked at as an opportunity for continue to be a mixed-use retail area. The shopping areas there are destinations both for local Cambridge residents as well as people in the broader region. So maintaining some retail use in that district is something that we'd anticipate would complement kind of a broader mixed-use development in that area. Within the quadrangle, again, which was the area of greater focus as a part of this because of just kind of the development pressure in that area and kind of anticipation of just a broader opportunity for change there. This was an area that that was subdivided into 3 sub areas. Here, number 3 is the quadrangle residential focus area. It's as we're approaching the Cambridge Highlands neighborhood, that's an area that was seen where having a residential focus would be beneficial just to allow for that transition. Here, in the remainder of the area, we have kind of a mixed use, mixed-use vision for the area with a mix of commercial and residential uses in this area here. And what we're showing as the quadrangle mixed-use light industrial area in this portion of the quadrangle. Some of you, I think, are familiar with this. We had presented previously, but the one of the themes that came out of the process was the opportunity to provide space for light industrial mixed use as a part of the future planning of the quadrangle of Alewife. And it was seen as an opportunity to provide for an opportunity for lower barrier to entry jobs. It's something that I think that ties back to the broader themes that were discussed as part of the Envision Cambridge process, as far as equity, as far as economic opportunity, and it was an opportunity to provide for some of the unique character that exists in that portion of the Alewife district today, and allow that to contribute to the future character of the district. So this is just a graphic of what that could look like with a larger first floor area that could double as both light manufacturing space and an active showcase area facing the public realm. As you can see as well, there's this feature which is another thought that came through this process of an elevated sidewalk that serves as both a feature to help mitigate against the risk of flooding, but also can serve as a unique urban design feature for the district. And that really is representative of kind of how we've been thinking about how to approach the climate-related risks that this area faces, with the desire to really encourage a walkable, connected, built environment. As part of this process, and as Eric will speak to more in the urban design guidelines, the intent was not to have necessarily for the responses to climate change and mitigating the impacts of climate change to be in conflict with the goals of a walkable district, but really to leverage the two of them together, and to create a unique identity and character for the neighborhood, and a sense of place in the neighborhood that really brings those two together. So with that, I will get ready to turn it over to Eric, but I wanted to pause to see if there are any questions before I do so.
Yeah, in the conceptual illustration, it looks like there's a bridge that goes over the railroad. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so this notion of... Could you speak at that mic? Yeah, sure. So the quadrangle area right now is both landlocked and sort of very disconnected from transit use. There is a bus line that runs along Concord Ave, but really it's closed off by roadways with very few access points that all kind of lead to the same street. So congestion, as Gary was talking, traffic congestion is a big issue in that area. And then there's a couple of rotaries. Actually, I should probably go to the diagram. We can see it even here. So the issue of this whole section between the commuter rail tracks here and the roadway here, this side you just go to the Cambridge Highlands neighborhood, and then Blanchard Road becomes your barrier. But really, there's Blair Pond, Rafferty Park, and there's really not a good connection there. So all traffic, vehicular traffic, ends up landing here. So in this theme of connectivity, and also coupled with the vehicular congestion, one of the things that we have thought about, not just in this process, but well beyond, and pretty much every iteration of planning for Alewife, is how to better connect people here in the quadrangle up to the Alewife T station, which is right here. So if we could get people across from here, suddenly what seems like an interminable walk to get from here to here would become much more of a doable thing. It's been really challenging. We have in planning board special permits for all the development that's happened in the southern section of the triangle. The board has asked people to reserve landing sites for a bridge. There have been contributions financially towards design of a bridge. We have done feasibility study and some conceptual design. We've tried to get federal funding for it. It's an expensive proposition. We also have some landing sites on the south side right here. So it's not something that has materialized yet, but it is something that it's hard in every planning process. It's incredibly difficult to think about this area and not come up with that as a recommendation. But I will say that the city manager has really emphasized to us that we have no funding for this. I just want everybody to be really clear. It's not a funded thing, but it is something that we think is important to keep in the planning picture so that we can continue to make sure that we don't preclude this happening, and also can continue to leverage development to try to make that happen. In more, well, very recently, this section has changed hands after a very long time. And so there are folks who are starting to have conversations to try to figure out what might happen there. And one of the big challenges in the Alewife area, particularly in the quadrangle, is how fragmented the property ownership is. But this is kind of a consolidated chunk, so there might be some possibility for things to happen in a way that they haven't been able to happen before.
I have another question about that. So just connecting the quadrangle with the Cambridge Park Drive, is there any reason why there hasn't, or like what is the main obstacle for like a Sherman Street style road connecting the bottom with the top? Like why not just have a railroad crossing?
An at-grade crossing?
Yeah.
So that's something that the T is not doing anymore for the most part. It's very challenging from a safety perspective, and this is quite a well-used stretch. I mean, so is, of course, it's the same track as at Sherman, but that is not something that they are that they're actively doing now. The T. In fact, that's part, one of those are the kinds of challenges when you think about any kind of connection below grade, above grade, or at grade, which is traversing all of the clearances and the utility related restrictions around the railroad. So it's also incredibly wide, which is why the tracks are wide, which is also why it's an expensive proposition. And because you have to be quite high, then your the ramps to come down to grade are quite extensive, need a fair amount of space. And those are all things that make it more complicated and more expensive, and partly why it hasn't happened yet.
On the bridge?
On the,
okay.
I'm just curious, is there some guesstimate of what this would cost now in today's dollars? Am I talking $10 million, $50 million? I mean,
I think the last estimate we did was a few years ago, and we were thinking it would be in the order of $25 million or so.
All right, Eric.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Gary. My name is Eric Thorpelson. I'm with the CDD doing urban design. Let me forward these slides a bit. So, since we've completed the planning process, we've been working internally to develop design guidelines, and this is a really quick overview of highlights. They're still in process. We want to get your feedback. There's quite a bit to go over, so I'm going to try to really buzz through them. I'll stop in the middle after one of the sections for questions and comments if you want to ask any, and then obviously at the end. The guidelines support and supplement the Alewife planning study. They're meant to convey intended character. There will be a guide for design review, particularly your design review process, and they're guidelines. They're not mandatory requirements. The Alewife planning study lays out principles for the guidelines. Basically, the big idea is to transform, sort of like Gary said, transform Alewife from a peripheral area dominated by parking lots with little vegetation, poor connectivity, and in many places a difficult pedestrian environment, into a new center of life in Cambridge. Create a sense of place, create pedestrian-friendly streets, create varied and beautiful and usable open spaces, integrate sustainability and resilience into the design of open spaces and buildings. Fundamental to the transformation is the creation of a pattern of human-scaled urban blocks and landscaped open spaces, using on the left is it this middle button is on the left is just using a swatch of the quadrangle as an example. The existing pattern is very large blocks, a discontinuous street network, and poorly defined public space. You've seen it. Just as a sort of conceptual example of how development might occur, recommended to create a connective network of landscaped open spaces, streets and paths, and a sort of hierarchy of street types. And then even more conceptually, on the right is a pattern of how things might develop at the next level down in scale, where you create a kind of finer grained pattern in urban terms of porosity and permeability of smaller courtyards, parks, gardens, and paths. On that drawing, the kind of orangish buildings are existing, and the kind of lighter yellow ones are purely figments of imagination that might represent what might happen someday. Next. So, open space in the public realm. The big idea is to create meaningful and memorable open spaces, whether they're squares, parks, streets, designed for a variety of uses. These will be public rooms at the scale of the city, like the parts of the city that you already know well. Open space should be designed in response to anticipated future flooding. I'll just really buzz through this. You understand the ideas. And they should protect residents and workers from extreme heat with shade, increased vegetation, high albedo surfaces. Albedo, A-L-B-E-D-O. They should augment Cambridge's urban forest, create connected ecosystems, and help connect particularly the quadrangle to the surrounding parks and neighborhoods. We worked with DPW and UTIL on creating a sort of a sampler of prototypical street types of varying widths and sort of design intent in terms of what kinds of traffic. But the idea is for all of them to create complete streets that accommodate bicycles, people, pedestrians, cars in an appropriate balance for their situation. The design of sidewalks is going to be particularly important in terms of width, pedestrian passage, amenities, street trees, and so on, and that these vehicular streets are augmented by a system of multi-use paths that sort of flesh out that connectivity both within the district and also between the district and other surrounding areas. Parks, their basis should include flexible open spaces that can accommodate a wide variety of uses. Everything from events to impromptu uses. Combining flexible open areas and small seating areas to offer a variety of ways to use the park. And one strategy is to incorporate bordering, sort of specialized bordering areas that create a kind of more intimate scale and create a sense of edge for a larger open space. Stormwater mitigation features should be integral parts of the design. Park entrances are really important to give you the feeling that I've arrived in a special place. And the idea of providing protective, sort of more intimately scaled play areas with interesting and inventive structures and things to do. Squares and plazas are really the vessels for community at the kind of civic scale. They should incorporate, well, they should be framed by architecture, activated by ground floor uses of the buildings around them, incorporate flexible open areas for whatever sorts of events might happen, everything from performances to casual everyday use to demonstrations or whatever, and enriched and reinforced by the design of their landscape. So next we'll go over built form, the kind of role of built form, but should we stop now and you want to ask any questions or make any comments? Yes.
Where we are now to the sort of vision that you're...
Yes, it's a challenge. I mean, this is where your role and the role of guidelines will be really important, because almost all of this is going to happen through private development. And so how do we sort of nudge things to happen in a way that's conducive to thinking of the area as a kind of a whole and as a future integral part of the city, rather than every developer working independently. The system of streets is particularly important, and they'll need to be created both on existing public right-of-ways, but also some of those proposed streets that Gary showed run through areas where there isn't currently a street, connecting up, breaking up those large blocks. So I'm not sure exactly what the process is. Do you want to address that a bit?
I think this is where the board's review comes in. When you get a special permit project, if you think about Fawcett Street project, you asked the developer, based on the previous planning that we had done, to break up the large block and, in fact, create a roadway segment, break up their building into two sections. And that is now a street segment that will connect to the extension of Wheeler Street, which also the board required in the Wheeler Street residential project discussion. So this is really drives the incremental change that the board is able to influence through every project that comes before you. I think the larger the parcel is, which is kind of why I was talking about how exciting it is that there's some land assemblies starting to happen, but the larger the parcel is that you're working with, the more flexibility you have to talk to the developers and ask for some of these things to happen. But if it's a small constrained site, then it's a lot harder to make some of these positive things come to fruition. So it will happen over time. It's not a fast process, but city building is not a fast process overall.
Is the premise that the investment or initiative thinking's off the table? Is it really a hopeful private sector?
Yeah, so in general, that has been an approach that we've been able to use in Cambridge with pretty good success. Things in Kendall Square, also things in this area. It's just a matter of what is the pace of change. It's a little bit harder in our context. I think when you go to cities and towns where there's nothing and they're really trying to draw investment, then those areas tend to say, well, we're going to take this, we're going to do the infrastructure, and then we'll get people in. This is our way to draw them into our town. That is not something that Cambridge has needed to do in recent times. It was certainly done historically. If you think about the East Cambridge riverfront, that was a time when Cambridge was in a much different state and really needed to draw investment. And so the city in that case stepped in and made that initial investment to serve as a catalyst. I think we haven't really needed that in Cambridge in recent years.
One thing I might add, since I actually represented the board on the Alewife subcommittee for Envision Cambridge, one thing, and I think that question of would there be takings, would we be open to that as a strategy, was discussed at length, and generally we understood that that was the approach. The incremental approach was how the city generally proceeds, and that would be continued here. The one exception I think the committee really took to that was the bridge, and that we have been incrementally trying to get there for a long time. That might actually take some real investment from the city at some point, for all the various mitigation we have been able to receive from individual developers. That's one where, it might not be takings for a road, or it might be spending $20 million, but there was a real feeling, I think, from the committee that that kind of investment might be necessary to make this work.
Which would actually help jumpstart this process. It's not a large amount of money in the context of the city.
Yeah, and there were many of the property owners in the quadrangle had representation on the committee or were in the audience at all the meetings and spoke up, and were taking note of what was being said and what was going to be expected to make, frankly, the densities and changes in uses that people were talking about work for people. I mean, people were not unaware that this would increase property values and allow folks to build more. And from I would say the majority of the residents on the committee at a minimum, the only way that was going to work is if that bridge gets built.
Okay. Proceed. Okay. So, built form. In the urban environment, buildings frame and articulate human-scaled public spaces. And the idea of making occupiable, usable, beautiful public rooms that are legible, human-scaled, and engage their surroundings and activated by the buildings around them. So that's one point. Resilient design is going to be a crucial point in the design of buildings, elevating, as Gary talked about, elevating first floors above flood level, providing flood barriers where necessary. Uses below, as laid out in the plan, uses below the first floor are limited to parking and storage, elevate critical mechanical systems, and all the things you would expect, energy efficient design and so on. It's useful in an urban context to think about buildings as a series of horizontal zones, the traditional base, middle, and top. In this case, the pedestrian zone along the street wall zone that defines the spaces at the kind of scale of a street, the street as kind of the elongated public room, and then the building top that engages the sky and accommodates specialized program, and sort of accommodates, helps articulate the massing of the building. So just quickly going through these, the pedestrian zone horizontally continuous, varied as you walk along the street, getting the idea of permeability and sort of connectivity as that sort of continuous pedestrian layer kind of flows through the city. Pedestrian scale enhanced by canopies, awnings, recessed entrances, all those traditional urban street things you know. Transparent facades or open facades in restaurants that connect interior space out to the sidewalk. The issue of protecting from flooding, elevated sidewalks to give continuous access to those elevated first floors. And the idea of building forecourts setting back from the street, not only to break up long facades like we're tending to get on some of these buildings, but also to provide a place to put stairs and ramps that get you up to that +4 level. And parking and so on can be down below, sort of interwoven in the section. The street wall zone, that buildings along streets their facade should align to create a kind of coherent boundary to that street, that kind of visual enclosure, and yet also provide variety in scale and materials, subtle changes in plane or larger setbacks to create courtyards for visual variety and interest. The building top differentiated everything basically from simple cornice that that creates an edge to set back top floors to specialized differentiated top floors to balconies, terraces, and sort of articulated penthouses that break down the scale. And these all depend on building use, function, what's up there, context, all the normal things you'd expect. Roofs, high albedo roofs, white roofs, blue roofs, vegetated roofs are all recommended. Roofs should be solar energy ready, and roof gardens useful. Basically, the guidelines don't want to see exposed tops of parking garages. That something should be up there, whether photovoltaics or rooftop terraces that provide amenity for people in the buildings. Building materials. The building should be built out of high quality, durable materials. Designed and selected to minimize energy use. Avoid predominantly glass facades for their energy, the difficulties with energy, and consider ideas such as green walls, fixed and operable sun shading devices, of course operable windows, and light colors to basically raise the albedo of the whole district. And then finally, architectural character, the idea of the two themes of sort of diversity and variety on the one hand, and on the other, framing a coherent streets and squares and parks. Provide, and at the kind of a more small scale level, provide visual interest in terms of scale of motifs, detail, proportion, relief, shadow lines, and so on. So that is the really quick overview. So this is preliminary, it's still in process. It will, as it's developed, incorporate ongoing studies and plans, particularly the Climate Resilience Zoning Task Force, Climate Change Preparedness and Resilience Plan, and the Urban Forest Master Plan. So these will all sort of start to inform this. But we'd love to have your feedback, including additional topics that you think should be addressed or problems you see or whatever. So go ahead.
Okay. Tom?
Well, it's pretty simple. It's actually, I think, building on what Steve was saying. I appreciate the work and the illustrations. It's a pretty remarkable vision. But here at the planning board, where the rubber meets the road, we have to try to figure out how we can realize this vision. And what I would encourage you to think about is how do you incentivize these property owners to move in this direction. We don't have many tools as a city, but certainly accessory retail use at the parking lot at the, I don't want to bring up accessory buildings again, but if you took the mall that's there, they obviously are full national tenants with leases and all of that stuff. What can you do to that owner to incentivize them to change the physical character of that property? And as I said, we don't have very many tools. You can give them more FAR, you can give them more height, you can here, help me, what else do we got? It's a carrot rather than a stick to figure out, okay, well, what are the mechanisms we can use to not only move the shopping mall, but then, as Aram has let us know tonight, all the smaller property owners in the quadrangle, is there a way in which you can say, okay, you complete this section of this street, we'll give you whatever, an FAR boost of a certain percentage. I think it's got to work that way rather than relying on the planning board to kind of be really fuss budgets around the special permit process to insist that this stuff happens. It's too incremental, and I just don't think it's strong enough.
To that point, Tom, I mean, our existing zoning does incorporate some of those kinds of strategies, and I think you're right to remind us that those might need to be further fine-tuned. But those are things that that come into play when somebody has already decided to develop. I think it's hard for us to create an incentive so great that it makes somebody come to the table, especially in the context of, they say, the shopping center, which is owned by this older family that probably has, it's not like I don't really know the financial situation, but there's multiple players in the multiple siblings in the family.
They're not. They don't always behave as perfectly rational economic actors.
Thank you. Yes. In fact, the last time we did planning, we had a member of that the family on our working group, and who was very excited, and during the process just bought into the vision. This is, when Catherine used to work at CDD, so ages ago. Dinosaurs roamed the earth. They got excited, they got architects, they came up with a phasing plan. It was so close. And this was one of the younger people in the family, and as soon as the senior members of the family discovered what was going on, they sort of yanked the chain. He never showed up at committee meetings again, and the plan completely disappeared. We don't have documentation of it, but it's one of those things that's incredibly lucrative the way that it is functioning right now, and there is a lot of for a family that doesn't necessarily need something different to happen. It's just a steady source, and that would get disrupted if you did redevelopment. So in some ways, the risk of doing something is probably a challenge. So I'm obviously attributing a lot of what the rationale might be, which is all which is all speculative. But this is the sort of situation we often find when there are family dynamics at play, when a lot of when folks have owned a parcel for generations. So I think that's why it's helpful to keep in mind that as long as we have the vision and we have put into place the tools, the right tools, when the time comes that it changes over, at least we have the framework in place that it will happen in alignment with that vision. We did multiple versions of looking at the Volpe site. It's taken generations for that to come to some semblance of fruition, and we were not quite there yet. But at least, when it happened, we were at the table. We had a certain vision, because 20 years ago, they might not have needed to come to us because the playing field, the zoning for that site was completely different. So it's just to say that the planning is worthwhile, even if it takes a while for it to manifest itself into reality. Sorry to be the downer.
Can I just comment a little bit on that? First of all, the shopping center right now, it is a profitable, functioning property right now. And there may be family issues, but it takes a lot to motivate somebody to take a productive, profitable property and start from scratch. There's risk and so forth. So on the other side of the highway, however, is a very different situation. A lot of those properties are underutilized and are just waiting for an opportunity to increase their value. So why don't they do something? I don't know. I think this is an instance where the city could and should be jump-starting the activity there, and maybe the bridge is a first critical step, and maybe others. But I think people, and I don't know, I'm purely speculating. I don't know who the owners are and what they're about. But just knowing the way private property owners think in general, I think they would like to see some sort of commitment and investment by the city to indicate, not just in paper and visions and stuff, but by action and investment, that the city is committed to making this happen.
So I think to that point, and also to Tom's, I think both that you're right about property owners did speak up and say some tangible showing that the city is committed to this vision would be helpful. But at the same point, I think we are already seeing that action by both the property owners and the city. The city has been spending quite a lot of money, not only on the planning, but on land acquisition for the various parts, not spending money, but, slowly but surely acquiring the pieces of land for road segments, for the bridge, et cetera, et cetera. I think the market is driving a lot of this in terms of action on the quadrangle side. But it is the case that we've had zoning in place, and I guess the zoning that has been in place that gives a lot of FAR incentives, and it does, has been in place since, as Iram noted, back in the day when I was on the staff. Yeah. And it's now gotten to the point where the rest of Cambridge is so saturated that there is starting to be land aggregation in Alewife, which hasn't happened previously. And that, these property owners were coming to this meeting to say, okay, what is the mitigation I'm going to need to do in order to get that density that I already see is in the zoning that's available to me when I want to come here?
There is big things are about to happen because somebody has bought up and gotten most of the parcels to the point, but he sure would like to understand probably how much FAR bonus he'll get if he builds a bridge,
right.
And he's probably in a position to do that, but it's that kind of horse trading is really coming down the tracks really, really quickly. And how much FAR or how much height could he get if he put the streets in? And he's got enough parcels so that, as I understand it, I don't know all the details, but I don't remember the guy. But he's been here before.
It's Cabot and Forbes that have acquired the old Mabardi site. Yeah.
They know how to do stuff.
So I really do think that, not that incentives aren't necessary, not that there won't be rezoning and some political horse trading, but some of this has already occurred in previous design efforts, and which is why we can or in previous rezoning efforts, which is why we can focus a lot of our efforts on, okay, what do we want the design to look like as these things start to happen? Yeah.
Curious as to how flexible the design guidelines are or will be. We've just started with the climate resiliency zoning, and we had a walking tour the other day. But surprisingly, I was hearing, people who I wouldn't necessarily have expected from talking about, well, the open space may be more important than the form, and that may be going up higher and having taller buildings in this area with much more open space around it, and questioning, I think, the street wall as being a necessity. That there were people arguing the environmental reasons not to have the street wall, but to have, buildings spaced apart, bigger buildings with green space between them. And
like a suburban office park.
well, I was thinking more of Volpe,
Yeah.
The plans for that. So I'm just, I don't know that that's where we'll come out now or we'll come out in 10 years from now, but I'm just curious, the design guidelines seem to be proposing a different type of structure than we may be hearing is what's desired from an environmental point of view.
So the guidelines are they're guidelines, so they are not essential to implement, and certainly not every single one of them, but they do establish the vision. And really the driving theme from an urban design perspective here is to be able to create a place where you would want to be, which has been a challenge for this area, particularly in the quadrangle, but I would say even more broadly. So the themes that we have been talking about here today that Eric has visualized for us are really going back to those principles. Now, but he did point out that this is the start, and we're not freezing this simply because there are those additional efforts underway at the city that will impact where we end up. And I think that in terms of thinking about what came up at the Resilience Zoning Task Force about open space, it will be worth us thinking about as we explore that idea a little bit further in terms of how to enmesh that with making a great place. Because if we just have kind of buildings in parks, we might see more like, it might end up more like the triangle, which is not necessarily, or the older version of the triangle, which is not something that people love to be in. So you do kind of need to integrate the two. It's possible that the open space is important, but it can be so configured that we might be able to have a street wall, and we might have open spaces in creating corridors in between buildings, kind of in the backs of buildings. I'm talking on the fly and making this up as I go, but ideas like that we are going to need to develop. So hopefully we can find a common ground between those two so that we are able to integrate both of those desires.
I'm going to look over towards the side. I haven't heard from any of you guys yet on this. Do you have any comments, Mary?
Well, I guess as somebody who predated the prehistoric age at CDD, I was involved in a couple of these different efforts, and so I hear what my colleagues are saying in terms of their concern about incremental change. I think I left in 94, right? So I started here in 78, and we've been talking about Alewife since way back then. It is a different day. Most of the city now is fairly developed, so perhaps this is the last frontier. And as Tom was saying, if there is aggregation going on, that's a good sign. I do think it would be helpful if the city was able to give it a little shot in the arm, though, because we have been so fortunate in that we haven't had to do it anywhere else, except for East Cambridge, really. But again, in some of those other areas, you did have, like down in Cambridgeport, you had Forest Cities, you had MIT, you had, big players and large landowners. So if this is headed that way, maybe you don't need a big shot in the arm, but maybe a shot in the arm for some of the little guys to try to get on board. Maybe it's unrealistic to think that they could get their parcel redeveloped and contribute towards streets, but if we could step up to the plate on some of that, it would be helpful. Back in the day, there were lots of grant programs and things like that. I'm assuming that probably most of those have gone away, or that Cambridge just is not in a position to qualify for them anymore. So we do have to find new tools. But I love the vision. I would like to see it happen before I'm no longer a resident.
The one thing I did want to say in terms of city investment is there were two significant pieces that came up in terms of connectivity. One was the notion of bridge across the tracks, and the other one was this is Terminal Road, and under the bridge it connects this side of the shopping center and the quadrangle to the main Whole Foods side of the shopping center, and it's a challenging prospect to think about how that might be made a more formal connection, and that connection formalized. But we are actually working on that particular piece, and that would involve the city participating financially. We've been in conversations with the property owners, including both the utility as well as the commercial building here, to try to figure out what might be the possibilities. It's not straightforward. That is, the board might recall that that was an idea that came up during the Wheeler Street discussions. So in terms of where we are, it's a more modest scale than a bridge across the tracks, but we are certainly starting to think about that and try to figure out some of those infrastructure challenges, because some of the statements at the Alewife Working Group were things like, well, if we can figure out a pathway for people who live in this area to be able to get through and connect to the rest of Cambridge, even if it's by bicycle or by transit, not in their cars, that is going to be a tremendous benefit. We are, of course, thinking about not just a terminal road. We're not just thinking about bicycle pedestrian, but also vehicular. But there are challenges. As long as this is a big parking lot, it's not the easiest thing to accomplish. It will involve conversations with some challenging players here. Eversource, not the easiest people to talk to, but we are certainly working on it.
But good training for talking with the MBTA.
Then we talk to more often.
Just, I remember that it did come up when we were talking about the project on Wheeler Street, which, I think that connection is really critical. And not only will it help Wheeler Street, but I think if you get that, and they've already said they will do the other connections between Wheeler and Fawcett. I think that is going to be a big shot in the arm. And then the rest of it is, maybe it's just some of it, maybe you get land donations, some of it maybe actually the city takes it or whatever. But I mean, there's smaller pieces then, so to me, it's that the connection you're talking about and the bridge are really the two big ones. Yeah.
Well, I think the framework that's been presented to us tonight is really, very sophisticated and has a real ring of, that's what we really would like to see. I would add to the bucket list of critical public actions is the diagonal green line between 1 and 2 is that getting more connective open space and flood control, etc. It may rise to a point where the city has to be more active in doing that. So I've been working for almost 20 years on a strip mall in Natick, which is about the size, actually, of the Fresh Pond Shopping Center, but nowhere near as healthy economically because there's a regional mall across the street. But 10 years ago, we managed to build 183 units on a portion of the property that was a completely unneeded parking lot because it'd been built for a big grocery store, which was no longer, had not been around for a long time. And last year they got permitted a parcel that replaced it had been built for service merchandise. That retailing concept really failed. It's got an 18-foot tall basement in it. It's a strange property. And then it became a gym. And the gym hasn't been able to really pay rent for a few years. And so they got permission to put another 70 or 80 units replacing the gym. So you can incrementally make changes. On the other hand, they're smart, enlightened owners. They understand things. But on the other hand, the Martinetti's finally sold. And that was a very difficult family situation. And for better or for worse, the Dow Stearns Trust families, driven by the needs of the third or fourth generation, have sold big pieces of Harvard Square. So it's not inconceivable, but having the right vision, having it be real, sort of, the Fish Book was a wonderful plan from 1980, the plan for Airwave, but it didn't have, it was a vision. We're now getting more into plans. And we have to be ready. We have to concentrate on the streets, the character of the streets, the open space, the uses, use whatever tools come to hand. So it's not inconceivable that this time it will actually result in more development. I mean, you can say Wheeler and Fawcett Street developments are a success of the last round of planning. So I'm curious, I must say, I take it the big land aggregation is in the one district up there. And I'm curious to know if they share the vision that came out of Envision for the types of land uses and our goals of trying to do something that would produce jobs for a certain set of skills.
So I'll let Iram speak to this more generally, but I will say this is another one where the idea is to incentivize those things. So you only get that FAR and height and all of that if you do both. If you do only office or lab, you don't get the part that we wanted for industrial.
Right. So we have had very initial conversations with the new property owners, and more along the lines of they have come to talk to us about what the vision is, to understand what the city wants, and then to start thinking about. I know that they have. This was a few months ago, and they have more recently said, well, when are you maybe going forward with your rezoning? They have not been, I think they are thinking more of a mix with some residential, some office, but they have not been opposed to the notion of light industrial. At least they haven't said so. So I think partly it will be a case of what exactly that it is that they want to do in the end. Do they need a rezoning? How will the timing work out? Because certainly the formulation that we've talked about, we don't have in place yet. So if they wanted to go right away, then they would have to go through a rezoning process. However, if they have the ability to wait while we flesh out, conclude our resilience zoning work and then think of a more comprehensive rezoning for the area, then that might be an easier path for them. So there's a number of things that are a little bit up in the air. I think they are doing their early due diligence, but at least they haven't said, wow, this is a crazy idea, we would never do this. So they seem to be open. Plus, when we talk light industrial, we're not talking the super traditional light industrial. We're talking about some of the legacy uses that you have here already, like the
Iggy's. Iggy's was the one that repeatedly came up. Iggy's, the bakery there, it's like that uses like that need to be able to stay and to be encouraged.
So I have two types of comments. One is about general connections, and the other is about legal recourses for the city to help make these connections possible. So having lived on Cambridge Park Drive above the quadrangle, it felt pretty isolated as it is. It's basically a big cul-de-sac, and so all the traffic around there has to go through that one intersection, which in rush hours can, take up the entire road. And so while it's encouraging to see that the planning process is thinking about a pedestrian bridge, I do think that some sort of vehicular bridge or tunnel should also at least be considered. So I asked about a at-grade crossing, but whether it's above or below grade, it seems like if the problem is financial and the problem with the pedestrian bridge is also financial, they should be considered together as, two things we would like to have, if not for the lack of money. And the other sort of connections that I'd like to sort of see, or that I would think would help benefit this whole neighborhood is, as you well know, the commuter rail tracks and Alewife Brook Parkway are essentially just big walls, like they're conceptual walls that box in this neighborhood. And so sort of more pedestrian crossings, I think, would be better. I wouldn't treat this as something that will be resolved if the mall is turned into something different. Alewife Brook Parkway is just a really crowded, fast-moving street, and so additional pedestrian crossings, I think, would be good for, this is like essentially part of North Cambridge, but North Cambridge doesn't get across Alewife Brook Parkway, so it just feels like this exurb of North Cambridge. And then the last so one connection, I think, is connecting 5 with 1 and 2 via car, as well as bike and pedestrian. The second is just more bike and pedestrian crossings between 5 and 6 and 2 and 4 and I guess sort of 2 and 3 in Fresh Pond, but that's less of a big deal. But then the last big connection, I think, is connecting the Minuteman bike path with the Charles River. So, the Minuteman bike path goes far off into the north from here. And it sort of stops and diverts east toward Davis Square. Yeah, right. And I think that's good. I support bike paths, but it also, I think, should come down. It should come south through this whole neighborhood. And so right now, if you're on a bike, you have to go over this bridge that's shared by pedestrians on Alewife Brook Parkway, which can be a nightmare. And then you're surrounded by these rotaries, which are nightmares. So all in all, it's a nightmare to be on a bike in this neighborhood. And so I think that needs to be part of the planning process. Is if you're on a bike in north of this map and you want to get south of this map, make it happen. So whether it's right, so I'd just like to see an emphasis on that. So not just bike paths within the neighborhood, which is good, but specifically a sort of commuter bike path that goes from the top to the bottom.
Yeah. So actually, I'm not quite sure why we did show this. We are going to add this on. But we acquired this little segment here that used to be a railroad, the Watertown line of the railroad. And when there was one train that used to run when they stopped, we acquired this section. This section, the DCR is building the pathway now.
Oh, great.
And so connecting all the way to Watertown. This section is not yet designed, but we've been collaborating with the DCR on the southern section. This piece we don't yet own, and there has been a long-term vision to have some sort of connection this way to connect all the way even to Porter Square. But also the the version that you're talking about for connecting to Linear Park from Minuteman and then onward absolutely is part of the regional multi-use path vision. I do want to say that there are a few challenges. There's more than a few challenges mobility-wise in Alewife, but some of the ones that you touched upon are some of the most acute. Part of it is who owns these roads, and some of these are state-owned roads, so the city has very limited capability of being able to impact. I mean, we advocate for changes, and there are instances where we have been able to make change. So, for instance, the fact that what feels pretty subpar right now, but the sidewalk along Alewife Brook Parkway was something that the city really worked hard with DCR on a couple of decades ago. And at that point, that was such a win. Now it doesn't feel like anything. But so, making, again, those kinds of changes is a pretty significant process. It's just like we're talking about all of the challenges here is just that there are so many thorny ownerships that trying to make sense of any of these things, it's not like the city could just act on its own or work with one property owner and make it happen. So being able to get a ton of crossings across here, this is considered a pretty significant arterial by the state. So they are not, again, very amenable to having a lot of different crossings, but we have talked about how can we make the crossings that exist be more pedestrian friendly. Because certainly, like the one that exists here, between the two parts of there's a light there right now between the two sections of the shopping center. It's still not the most easy one to traverse, whether you're on foot or you're on bicycle. So, thinking about improving that. Similarly, the Ringe Ave crossing is a little bit better because, well, it's a longer signal for one, but it still doesn't feel really pedestrian friendly. So I would say those are areas of focus. I think the notion of having more crossing points is a good one, but right now there's not a lot of where you could go because it's a bridge as well. The Alewife Brook Parkway in this section is essentially a bridge. So unless you have new development here that might connect to a bridge, or new development here on the shopping center that might connect at an upper level to the bridge, those might be possibilities. But short of that, it's a little bit, in this stretch at least, it's a little challenging. I would say the auto piece is also difficult. I don't know if Catherine wants to speak to it or if I should, but
I think there are a couple of things about the auto bridge or auto connections between the triangle and the quadrangle. The first being there's no consensus about whether or not it would be a good thing. Everyone agrees that pedestrian and bicycle connection is essential, and I don't think you could say even half are totally in favor. You have some people who think you absolutely need an auto connection, some people who think that would be the death of the Highlands neighborhood and the surrounding neighborhood around the parkway, and it would be a disaster, and are strongly opposed to it. There are some people who think we should do vehicular shuttles so that could run between, because it's still not a short walk. But then you have all of the cost and engineering associated with a vehicular bridge to run one bus every 15 minutes. I think, everyone, there is consensus that it's really important to get bicycles and pedestrians across there. And I think the vehicular part, because it is super controversial, and my sense is that only in the context of a new commuter rail station or other significant investment in that area would it really be something that we could move forward with, just because of the cost of it, if nothing else.
So we have talked about a bridge incorporating both a new commuter rail stop here, in addition to just vehicular and, just bike and pedestrian. And that actually would be a huge benefit for this area. Once again, it involves working with a whole other state agency. But we have thought about whether, so a big shuttle bus might not be feasible, but you might be able to have little autonomous shuttle that carry a few people rather than a bigger bus. That may be more feasible. But otherwise, just to what Catherine was saying, essentially, if you're just creating a path for people who are coming down here, and most of this is, well, not most, but a very significant chunk of this is regional traffic that has no origin or destination in this part, but not even in Cambridge. So now you might have people who have no real purpose being here, coming down or coming up from Route 2, taking here, seeing, oops, looks crowded. Let me go down here, take a bridge, cut through here, and into either Belmont or whatever. So suddenly you're now having traffic on streets where it really has no purpose, and it's not even the arterial. So that's really the challenge of allowing the vehicular crossing that we are grappling with. But clearly being able to think through and sort out some of the transportation challenges here is one of the biggest secrets to unlocking Alewife. We've talked about even things like Route 2 having dedicated bus lanes, advocating for that, so that you're able to essentially create the connection that the Red Line might have had it proceeded beyond Alewife onto Lexington. But in any case.
I had two comments. One was about the connections. The other is about the sort of legal remedies for the city. And so we've talked about sort of FAR benefits as a carrot, and I'm curious sort of what sticks the city is contemplating. So, one obvious stick is eminent domain. I haven't heard any discussion about sort of what the city might be interested in acquiring for the creation of these paths. I'd just be curious sort of what is Envision's stance on the use of eminent domain to do this. Another stick is development impact fees. And so we have incentive zoning for housing, but this seems like the perfect opportunity for incentive zoning for building the bridge or all these other connections. We talked about rezoning. So I'm just curious, it seems like in the existing ordinance, we have a thing that works sometimes, but it seems like this is a planning process that might require more than just giving FAR benefits.
Yeah. So yes, to the last item, we have discussed at the committee the notion of some sort of, whether we call it an impact fee or just some sort of fee that gets attached to commercial development at any rate to support some of this infrastructure. Yes, the committee's talked about that. That would be part of a zoning that would advance from this. In terms of eminent domain, that's a challenging question. It kind of goes back to the question that I think either Tom or Steve asked about how are we going to bring this to fruition. And the approach that we have used is a little bit less hands-on. I think probably the terminal road piece that we are talking about would be that could be an eminent domain process, but we try to work with friendly takings in the city because we have had so many challenges with instances where it's not been that. So most recent case in point being Vale Court, which we acquired for affordable housing, and it's now embroiled in litigation with no end in sight. But for this terminal road connection, I think we would be open to a friendly taking, and that's why we're having all of those conversations with the abutting property owners. And again, when the opportunities arise, such as the Watertown branch multi-use path, that was something that we took advantage of right as soon as possible.
We've given you a chance to comment. Do you have anything you want to add at this point?
It only makes sense to make a pedestrian and a motor vehicle bridge to go into this area. How many thousand people are going to enter this area if this gets fully developed? I would like to see some kind of a thoroughfare put through here, a Comm Ave type of street line, tree-lined. Do it well, make it turn back onto Concord Ave so it comes back around. I just think there's so much, it'll generate so much traffic. Now, there are other issues on 16 that have to be addressed at the same time. The capacity is not there. There is some talk about expanding Route 2 and not for buses. I don't know how the city does this without putting some skin in the game, as they say. To put it all into developers, I think it all becomes very incremental, and you get a building at a time. Some of the bigger landowners, the Body piece, they're way up in the corner. They're waiting. They're waiting to see what happens because it's a long way from 16 to their piece. I don't know. I'd like to see it done well. It's just difficult. Without the city kind of leading the way and drawing people there, I think that's exactly what we'll get, is one building at a time. All the ideas are great. I like all the connectivity and stuff, but without the major pieces, I don't know if you get what you're looking for.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and for sharing your thoughts on where we are and what the design guidelines look like, and indulging all of our not topic questions that were not on the topic of the evening. I didn't ask about transcripts. That's the one thing I blew past. So before I let everybody go, we did have one transcript that was completed and certified complete for January 8th. Can I have a motion to accept such a transcript?
Second.
All those in favor? All right. Unless there are any other items? No? Good. We're adjourned.